The stillness of the parking lot shattered as a voice sliced through the crisp autumn air. Sharp and commanding, like the crack of a whip against dry leather. "Step out of the car now," Officer Michael Drake bellowed, his tone dripping with unchecked authority. The sodium lights overhead flickered faintly, casting jagged shadows across the cracked asphalt, bathing the nearly deserted lot in pools of sickly amber glow. The night had grown late, most of the precinct's officers long gone, leaving only the hum of distant traffic and the rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement. In the evening breeze, Sarah Chen turned slowly, her movements deliberate, her posture unshaken despite the aggression barreling toward her. Standing beside her unmarked patrol car, she exuded a quiet strength, her plain cloth Essa-tailored blazer and sensible show sconceling the weight of the power she carried. At 43, she had climbed the ranks of the Bedford Police Department with a resolve forged through years of grit and perseverance. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and though her attire lacked the flash of a uniform, there was an elegance in her bearing, a subtle grace that spoke of someone who had earned her place. "I'm authorized to be here," she said, her voice steady, a calm anchor in the rising storm of tension. But Drake wasn't listening. His hand rested on his holster, fingers twitching with the instinct of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. His eyes narrowed, glinting with hostility as he barked again, "Don't argue with me. Step back, or I'll make you." The air thickened with his words, the venom in them clinging to Sarah like a bitter fog. She felt it settle over here, a familiar sting, a quiet insult she'd endured too many times before. Raising a hand, she tried to cut through the escalating aggression. "You don't want to do this. Just let me." But before she could finish, Drake lunged forward, his movements swift and forceful. His hands slammed against her shoulders, shoving her backward until she stumbled against the cold metal of her car. The impact jolted through her, stealing the breath from her lungs for a fleeting moment. "People like you don't belong here," he snarled, his voice low and guttural, his face twisting with contempt. The words hit harder than the shove itself, each syllable laced with a prejudice he didn't bother to hide. Sarah's chest tightened, a flicker of anger sparking beneath her composed exterior. "People like you," she'd heard it before, whispered in academy hallways, muttered behind her back during her early years on the force, but the sting never dulled. Humiliation burned in her throat, hotter than the dull ache spreading across her back where it had collided with the car. Straightening herself with deliberate calm, she brushed the dust from her jacket, her fingers trembling slightly not from fear, but from the effort to contain the storm brewing inside her. She locked eyes with him, her gaze piercing through the arrogance radiating off him like heat from a furnace. "What did you just say?" she asked, her voice low but edged with steel. Drake sneered, his posture swelling with the misplaced confidence of a man who believed his authority was untouchable. "I said you don't belong here. Now leave before I have to call backup." His words dripped with condescension. His chest puffed out as if daring her to challenge him. He stood there, a 50-year-old veteran of the force, his weathered face etched with lines of bitterness, his uniform a second skin he wore like armor. For 15 years, he'd walked these streets, his prejudices woven into every interaction, though he'd scoff at anyone who dared call him out. To him, the world was simple. He gave orders, and people followed, especially people like her. But then Sarah did something that stopped him dead in his tracks. With a slow, measured movement, she reached into her pocket. Drake's hand flinched toward his weapon, his instinct screaming threat, his pulse quickening as adrenaline flooded his system. He braced himself, ready to drag one till she pulled out not a gun, but something far more devastating. In her hand gleamed a badge, its polished surface catching the harsh light of the parking lot. Not just any badge, but the emblem of the chief of police. The air seemed to vanish from the space between them. Drake's eyes widened, his sneer dissolving as the realization crashed over him like a tidal wave. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale and hollow, his bravado crumbling into dust. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't speak, his mind racing to process the unthinkable. He had just assaulted his commanding officer. Sarah held the badge steady, her expression icy, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Chief Chen," she said simply, letting the weight of her title settle over him. Drake stammered, his tongue tripping over itself. Chief Cheney, his hand dropped from his holster as if it burned, his shoulders slumping under the sudden shift in power. The man who moments ago had towered over her with arrogant certainty now seemed smaller, diminished, a shadow of the figure he'd been. "Yes, Officer Drake," she continued, her tone arctic, unyielding. "Would you care to explain why you just assaulted your commanding officer?" The question hung there, heavy and damning, as the night closed in around them. The silence that followed was suffocating. Drake's mouth opened and closed, fish-like, but no words came. His mind churned, replaying every second of the encounter's shove, the venomous words, the assumptions he'd let guide him. He'd seen her plain clothes, her Asian features, her quiet demeanor, and built a story in his head: trespasser, outsider, someone who didn't belong. Now, that story lay in ruins, and with it, the unshakable authority he'd clung to for years. Sarah watched him unravel, her own thoughts a whirlwind of resolve and exhaustion. This wasn't just about Hair, it was about the rot festering in the department. The old guard who resisted change with every fiber of their being. Drake was a symptom, not the disease, but tonight, he'd given her the leverage she needed to start cutting it out. "Report to my office first thing tomorrow morning," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for defiance. "We'll discuss this incident in detail along with your future in this department." She turned and slid into her car, the door closing with a soft thud that echoed in the stillness. As she started the engine, she caught a glimpse of Drake in her rearview mirror, still standing there, frozen, a statue of shock and dread under the flickering lights. Driving away through the quiet streets of Bedford, Sarah's hands gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles whitening as she processed the weight of what had just happened. The cool night air slipped through the cracked window, carrying the faint scent of approaching rain. But it did little to soothe the fire in her chest. She'd spent decades climbing this ladder, 20 years of late nights, sit-along glances, and whispered doubts about whether she belonged. She'd fought too hard, overcome too much, to let this slide. Drake's actions weren't just a personal attack, they were a glaring symptom of a deeper sickness. Within the Bedford Police Department, since taking the chief's position, she'd felt the pushback from men like him. The old guard who clung to outdated ways and casual bigotry like lifelines. This confrontation was the spark she'd been waiting for, the crack in their armor she could pry open to force change. As she pulled into her driveway, her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a text from her deputy chief, James Rodriguez. "You okay?" Heard about what happened in the lot. Security footage caught everything. Sarah's lips curved into a grim smile. Evidence. That's what she needed. And Drake had just handed it to her on a silver platter. "I'm fine," she texted back, her fingers steady despite the adrenaline still humming through her veins. "But things are about to get interesting around here." Stepping out of her car, she paused, the night air brushing against her skin, heavy with the promise of a storm. Tomorrow would bring rain, and with it, a reckoning. She'd spent her entire career preparing for moments like this, battles not just for her own dignity, but for the soul of the department she led. Drake's downfall wouldn't be a simple reprimand or a slap on the wrist. It would be a lesson, one that rippled beyond him to every officer who thought power was a license to prejudge and punish. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about accountability, about dismantling the systems that let men like Drake thrive. As she walked toward her house, her steps firm against the pavement, Sarah Chen knew one thing for certain: the war for change had begun, and she was ready to fight it. The next morning dawned gray and humid, the sky a heavy blanket pressing down on Bedford. Sarah arrived at the precinct earlier than usual, her office a fortress of order amid the chaos she was about to unleash. The room held 20 years of law enforcement history, photos, commendations, a worn desk scarred with the marks of countless decisions, but today, it was the personnel files that mattered. She pulled Drake's from the stack, though she knew it by heart. 15 years of service, a handful of commendations, and a trail of civilian complaints that had somehow always been swept under the rug. The pattern was stark, a glaring red flag she'd noted long before this night. But it was only the beginning. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. James Rodriguez stepped in, balancing two steaming cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, setting one on her desk. His dark eyes studied her, concern flickering beneath his usual calm. "Drake's in the building." Looks like he didn't sleep a wink, probably spent the night replaying every dumb move he made. Sarah took the coffee, the warmth seeping into her hands as she nodded. James, she began, rising to pace toward the window. When I joined the force in '98, my training officer said something I've never forgotten. The badge doesn't make you right, it makes you responsible. I was the only Asian American woman in my academy class. The instructors called me exotic, like I was some curiosity instead of a cop. She stared out at the morning traffic below, her reflection faint against the glass. 20 years later, I'm still proving I belong. But this isn't just about me. James leaned against the doorframe, his silence an invitation for her to continue. He was younger than Drake, a decade into his career, with a sharp mind and a loyalty Sarah had come to rely on. His presence steadied her, a reminder that not everyone in the department was entrenched in the past. Drake's about to learn what responsibility really means, she said, turning back to him. And he's not the only one. This department's been coasting on old habits to long prejudice dressed up as tradition. That ends now. As she spoke, the door creaked open again, and Drake stepped in. His uniform crisp, but his face haggard. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, his jaw tight with a mix of defiance and dread. He stood there, a man who'd spent years wielding power without question, now facing the consequences of his own hubris. Sarah straightened, her gaze locking onto his. The room seemed to shrink, the air charged with the weight of what was to come. This wasn't just a meeting, it was the first strike in a battle for justice, a lesson in the cost of abusing power, and a chance to reshape a system that had protected men like him for far too long. For Drake, it was the beginning of a fall that would strip away everything he thought he knew. For Sarah, it was the start of a fight she'd been born to win. James Rodriguez lingered by the doorframe of Sarah Chen's office, his broad shoulders casting a faint shadow across the hardwood floor. His dark eyes flickered with a quiet contemplation as he watched her sift through the papers on her desk. The late afternoon sun spilled through the blinds, painting golden streaks across the room, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. He tilted his head slightly, his voice low and thoughtful. Your grandmother came here after the Cultural Revolution, didn't she? Back in '66. Sarah paused, her fingers resting on a file, and nodded slowly. She did. Landed on these shores with nothing but the clothes on her back, a fierce will burning in her chest, and a dream that her kids, me mom, my uncles, would have a shot at something better than the chaos she'd left behind. She didn't speak the language, didn't have a dime, but she had this unshakable belief that waiting for the world to hand you justice was a fool's game. She drilled that into me. You don't sit around hoping for a seat at the table, you build your own damn table and make them regret ever doubting you. Her voice carried a weight, a mix of pride and resolve, her lips curling into a faint, bittersweet smile as she remembered the old woman's stern, weathered face. Their conversation was sliced clean through by a sharp rap at the door. James stepped aside as Michael Drake appeared in the threshold, his usual cocky stride replaced by a jittery stiffness that made him look like a man walking a tightrope. Gone were the faded jeans and leather jacket he'd sported the day before. Now he stood rigid in a freshly pressed uniform, the starched fabric clinging to his frame as if it could armor him against the storm brewing in that room. His jaw was tight, his eyes darting, and his hands twitched faintly as he hovered there, waiting for permission to cross into the lion's den. "Comin', Officer Drake," Sarah said, her tone steady as she returned to her chair behind the desk. "Close the door." She watched him as he complied, noting the way his fingers fumbled with the knob, the slight tremble betraying the bravado he was trying so hard to project. He lowered himself into the seat across from her, and she caught a thin flicker in his expression, a stew of fear and something uglier, a simmering resentment bubbling just beneath the mask of compliance. Sarah leaned back, her gaze piercing as she folded her hands on the desk. "Before we dive into what happened last night, I want to understand something. You've been here longer than I have years under your belt, watching this department twist and turn through good times and rough ones. So tell me, Drake, what made you think it was okay to lay hands on anyone in that parking lot, let alone the person who happens to be your commanding officer?" Drake shifted uncomfortably, the chair creaking under his weight. His mouth opened, then closed. as if the words were stuck somewhere deep in his throat. "Chief, to want to apologize for what I did," he stammered, his voice tight. "I didn't realize it was you out there." "That's not what I asked," Sarah cut in, her words sharp enough to slice through his flimsy excuse. She leaned forward now, elbows on the desk, her dark eyes locking onto his. "Whether you knew it was me or not doesn't change the fact that your first move was to swing. I want to know why aggression is your default setting. What's going on in that head of yours?" The question hung there, heavy and unyielding, filling the space between them like a thunder cloud ready to burst. Drake's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding as he wrestled with a response that wouldn't dig his grave any deeper. His fingers gripped the arms of the chair, knuckles whitening. "I was trying to protect the precinct," he finally muttered, his voice low and strained, like it pained him to let the words out. "Things have been shifting around here too fast, too much. Not all of it feels right." Sarah's brow arched, her expression unreadable but her mind racing. "Shifting how, exactly? You mean changes like having a woman of color sitting in this chair?" Her tone was calm, but there was steel beneath it, a challenge he couldn't dodge. Drake's face flushed a deep crimson, his eyes dropping to the floor for a split second before snapping back to her. "That's not what I meant," he said quickly, too quickly, the defensiveness creeping back into his voice like a cornered animal baring its teeth. "Then enlighten me, Officer Drake," Sarah pressed, her voice cool and unrelenting. "Because from where I'm sitting, your file paints a pretty clear picture. 7 complaints from civilians in the last 3 years so from minorities, all swept under the rug by the old brass. Care to shed some light on that?" "They were investigated," Drake shot back, his tone hardening as he straightened in his seat. "Found to be baseless, nothing stuck." Sarah reached into a drawer and pulled out a stack of files, dropping them onto the desk with a deliberate thud. "Buried, not investigated," she corrected, her eyes never leaving his. "That ends today. You're suspended, effective immediately, pending a full review of your conductless night's stunt and every single one of these complaints. Badge and gun, on my desk, now." For a heartbeat, it looked like Drake might bolt or fight. His hands flexed, his chest heaved, and a dark storm brewed behind his eyes. But then, with a slow, mechanical precision, he unclipped his badge and slid his service weapon from its holster, placing them on the desk. The metal clinked against the wood, a sound as final as a coffin nail. He stood, towering over her for a moment, his voice a low growl. "This isn't over." "You're damn right it's not," Sarah replied, her calm unshaken as she met his glare. "It's just getting started." When Drake stormed out, James closed the door softly behind him and turned to Sarah, his expression grim. "He's not going down quietly. He's got buddies in the department, old-timers, the ones who liked things the way they were. They're going to push back hard." Sarah nodded, picking up Drake's badge and turning it over in her hands. The weight of it felt like a promise or a warning. "I'm banking on it," she said quietly. "Sometimes you've got to cut deep to get the poison out. This place has been rotting with bias and abuse for too long, and Drake just handed us the scalpel we needed to start carving it away." She set the badge down and turned to her computer, her fingers flying across the keys. "Send a memo to the whole department. All past civilian complaints are getting reopened. Reviewed by an independent committee, no exceptions." James whistled low. "That's going to stir up a hornet's nest." "Good," Sarah said, her voice firm as she kept typing. "The ones buzzing loudest are usually the ones with the most to hide." As James left to carry out her orders, Sarah reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a faded photograph. In it, her grandmother stood in front of their first home in America, cramped apartment above a laundromat, the paint peeling and the windows smudged. The old woman's posture was ramrod straight, her eyes blazing with a fire that no hardship could douse. Sarah traced a finger over the image, her lips moving in a soft whisper in Mandarin. "Watch me, Nai. Watch me fix this." The wheels were turning now, unstoppable as a freight train, and Sarah knew the road ahead would be brutal. The Bedford Police Department was a house built on shaky ground, and she was about to test every crack in its foundation. Down the hall, Michael Drake was already on his phone, his voice a furious hiss as he rallied his allies for the fight he swore she'd regret. But Sarah wasn't afraid. She had justice in her corner, a legacy of resilience in her blood, and a fire in her gut that no amount of pushback could smother. The storm was coming, and Bedford was about to see what real accountability looked like. By the end of the week, the air in the precinct was thick with tension, a palpable hum that followed Sarah like a shadow. Officers clustered in tight knots, their voices dropping to hushed murmurs whenever she passed. In the break room, Thomas Miller, a grizzled veteran with a perpetual scowl, held court over a steaming cup of coffee, his gravelly voice cutting through the chatter. "Drake's been here 15 years, he growled, jabbing a thick finger into the air. 15 years of solid work, and this new chief at Munson thinks she can just torch it all because of one bad night. She's out of her depth." Across the room, Detective Lisa Martinez sat with a case file propped open in front of her, her sharp eyes flicking up to catch every word. She was young, ambitious, and one of the few who saw Sarah's arrival as a lifeline rather than a threat. She scribbled a quick note on her pad, her pen moving with a quiet determination. She'd pass it along to James later, keeping Sarah one step ahead of the brewing mutiny. In her office the next morning, James delivered the briefing with a furrowed brow. "Miller's rounding up support," he said, leaning against her desk. "They're cooking something up, probably through the union. Word's out that Drake's hired Harrison Wells as his lawyer." Sarah's face remained a mask of calm, but inside, her mind churned. Wells was a shark 60, silver-haired, and notorious for defending cops in messy misconduct cases, turning them into public crusades. This was about to get loud and ugly. "What about our side?" she asked, scanning a report from the week's chaos. "Martinez is solid," James replied. "Most of the younger officers are leaning our way too. And get this, Captain Reynolds from Internal Affairs reached out. Says he's been itching to scrub this place clean for years, but never had the backing." Sarah's lips twitched in a rare half-smile. David Reynolds was a straight arrow, 20 years in and still clinging to a moral compass most had long since tossed aside. His support could tip the scales. "Dig into Drake's history," she instructed. "Every excessive force complaint, especially the ones that got buried. I want it all." As James headed out, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her sister Claire. "Saw the Bedford Gazette piece. You holding up?" The article sat on her desk, its headline screaming, "Police Chief Accused of Discriminatory Treatment by Veteran Officer." Drake's spin was all over it, painting him as a noble servant of the law persecuted by a radical reformer. She was about to reply when Captain Reynolds appeared at her door, his usually crisp demeanor frayed at the edges. "Got a minute, Chief?" he asked, closing the door behind him as she waved him in. He sank into the chair, placing a thick file on her desk with a heavy sigh. "I've been digging into those old complaints like you asked. It's worse than we thought. 5 years back, Drake roughed up a Hispanic kid during a stop, broke his arm. The complaint disappeared, but I kept my own notes." Sarah flipped open the file, her stomach tightening as she read. The boy's account was raw, fearful. Angry, and Drake's excuse was flimsy. Resisted arrest, no witnesses. Buried deep, Reynolds added, his voice grim. "But here's the kicker. 3 other officers were there that night. One was Robert Teresh, bolted to Chicago not long after. I tracked him down. He's willing to talk, but only to you." Sarah leaned back, her mind spinning with the possibilities. A cop breaking the code of silence could crack this wide open. Meanwhile, across town, Michael Drake sat in Harrison Wells' sleek office, his face red with fury as he recounted the parking lot clash. "She's gunning for me, Harrison. 20 years on the job, and now I'm the villain because I didn't clock her in civvies." Wells, sharp and calculating, scribbled notes as he listened. "The assault charge is tricky, Michael," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "But if we spin this as her targeting the old guard systematic bias against tradition, we've got a shot." Back in her office, Sarah stared out the window at the graying sky, the weight of her grandmother's legacy pressing against her chest. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a debt, a promise, a fight. And as the battle lines hardened, she knew one thing for certain: power unchecked bred corruption, and she'd tear it down brick by brick if she had to. The lesson was clear: consequences were coming, and no one, not even Drake, could outrun them forever. The air in Bedford was thick with tension, a restless energy swirling through the precinct and the streets beyond. Officer Michael Drake leaned back in his chair, the faint creak of worn leather punctuating the silence in his dimly lit living room. His phone rested heavily in his hand as he dialed one number after another, his voice low but laced with a simmering fury. Ever since she took over, it's been nothing but chaos. He muttered to a fellow officer on the line, his words sharp and accusing. Sensitivity training, community oversight boards? That's not policing, that's politics. His dark eyes flickered toward the window, where the last rays of a dying sun stretched long, jagged shadows across the quiet streets. To Drake, those shadows felt personal, a reminder of the night in the parking lot that had spiraled into this night he still insisted was nothing more than a misunderstanding. He clenched his jaw, rallying support from his comrades, determined to fight the tide threatening to drown his 20-year career. Meanwhile, across town in the heart of the Bedford Police Department, Chief Sarah Chen stood alone in her office, gazing out at the city she'd vowed to shield. The glass was cool against her fingertips as she traced the outline of the skyline, her mind churning with a storm of frustration and resolve. The setting sun painted the buildings in hues of amber and crimson, but to Sarah, it evoked darker memory, soft flashing lights, raised voices, and the glint of a badge misused. Her phone buzzed on the desk behind her, pulling her from her reverie. A text from Claire, her confidant and tether to calmer days, glowed on the screen. Remember what grandmother used to say, bamboo that bends is stronger than the oak that resists. A faint smile tugged at Sarah's lips, softening the hard lines of her face. She would bend, yes, but breaking, that wasn't an option, not when the stakes were this high. Earlier that day, her office had been a revolving door of revelations. Officer Jenny Parker, a rookie with only 6 months under her belt, had slipped in, her footsteps tentative against the polished floor. Her uniform still carried the crispness of the academy, but her eyes betrayed a nervous tremor as she glanced over her shoulder. "Chief, I need to tell you something," she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper, as though the walls themselves might betray her. "Last night, I overheard Miller and some others. They're planning to file a group complaint with the police commission. They're saying you're creating a hostile work environment for white male officers, specifically." Sarah's chest tightened, a cocktail of anger and gratitude swirling within her. She met Jenny's gaze, noting the young officer's clenched fists and the way her breath hitched slightly. "Thank you, Officer Parker," Sarah had replied, her tone steady but warm. "I know coming forward took courage." As Jenny slipped out, Sarah felt the weight of the rookie's loyalty settle on her shoulders, a fragile, precious thing in a department teetering on the edge of fracture. Moments later, Sarah had summoned her inner circle Captain Reynolds, a grizzled veteran with a salt and pepper beard and a quiet intensity, and James Rodriguez, her sharp-eyed deputy whose quick mind she'd come to rely on. Files spilled across her desk like battle plans, their edges curling from years of neglect. "We need to move faster," she declared, her voice cutting through the room's stillness. "Drake's case isn't just one bad night anymore. It's a window into everything this department has buried." James shifted uneasily, his brow furrowing as he weighed the risks. "If we push too hard, too fast," he began, but Sarah cut him off, her eyes blazing. "We push exactly as hard as we need to. This isn't about caution, it's about justice." She turned to Reynolds, her tone commanding. "Get me every complaint from the past 5 years, anything that smells like this." "James, book me a trip to Chicago. Officer Torres has a story, and I want to hear it straight from him." As her team scattered to their tasks, Sarah returned to the window, the city's pulse thrumming beneath her. She knew the fight was only beginning. Across town, the Bedford Herald's newsroom buzzed with its own frenetic energy. Michael Drake, polished in a civilian suit that couldn't quite mask the tension in his shoulders, sat across from editor-in-chief Richard Morton. Beside him was Harrison Wells, his attorney, a man with slicked-back hair and a voice as smooth as oil. Drake leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly, his tone thick with rehearsed emotion. 20 years I've served this community," he said, his voice trembling just enough to sell the narrative. Not a single complaint stuck. Then Chief Chen shows up, and suddenly I'm the villain, Morton. A weary man with wire-frame glasses and a reputation for fairness, nodded thoughtfully, scribbling notes on a pad. Wells jumped in, his words calculated and precise. My client was doing his job securing department property after hours. Chief Chen, out of uniform, refused to identify herself right away. The security footage? It's only half the story. What they didn't know was that Morton's desk already held an anonymous envelope. Its contents a ticking bomb records of civilian complaints against Drake and others. Complaints that had vanished into the department's shadows over decades. Back at the precinct, the morning headlines had landed on Sarah's desk like a slap. Police department in turmoil. Veteran officer claims discrimination screamed the Bedford Herald's front page. The ink still fresh. Linda Walsh, a seasoned reporter from Channel 12 News, sat across from her, recorder humming between them. Her sharp eyes studied Sarah as she asked, "Chief Chen, how do you respond to Officer Drake's allegations that your reforms target long-serving officers?" Sarah met her gaze unflinchingly, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Reform isn't about targeting anyone, it's about ensuring this department serves every citizen fairly. Tenure doesn't exempt accountability." Walsh pressed further, her tone probing. "And the parking lot incident? Drake's attorney says it was a misunderstanding. Exaggerated to push her agenda." Sarah's lips tightened briefly before she replied. "The cameras caught it all. I'd suggest reviewing that footage before buying anyone's spin." As Walsh left, James burst in, his face grim. "The city council's calling an emergency meeting. Councilman Gregory Peters is leading it, says it's about morale and safety." Sarah's jaw clenched. Peters, a conservative with deep police union ties, had fought her appointment tooth and nail. She knew this was personal. That night, Captain Reynolds and Detective Martinez, a weary officer with a quick wit and a fierce loyalty to Sarah, pored over dusty files in a dimly lit conference room. The air smelled of stale coffee and old paper as Reynolds dropped a thick folder on the table. "Chicago paid off," he said gruffly. "Torres will testify about the Martinez teenager Casases. The old brass forced him to rewrite his report. When he wouldn't play ball, they pushed him out." Martinez whistled low, shaking his head. "Social media's eating up Drake's sob story, calling him a victim of woke policing." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Then we shift the story with facts. Martinez, get our public affairs team on a Reaper 2s of 4 stats, complaint resolutions, demographics. Let the data speak." As her team dispersed, her phone lit up again. Claire, texting, "Local news is brutal. Need backup." Before Sarah could respond, James rushed in, tablet in hand. "Chief, look at this." On the screen, Drake's face filled a Channel 5 live stream, tears glistening as he spoke. "My father was a cop, his father before him. I've given my life to this city. And now Chief Chen wants to erase that because it doesn't fit her vision." Sarah watched, her expression unreadable. "He's good," she admitted, then a spark flared in her eyes. "But he just slipped. Legacy? Pull his father's records. Let's see what kind of policing runs in that family." The next morning, Sarah faced the city council in a chamber thick with silence and scrutiny. Councilman Peters, a stout man with a booming voice and a penchant for grandstanding, led the charge. "Chief Chen, officers say your leadership has poisoned morale. How do you answer that?" Sarah stood tall, her voice measured but unyielding. "Councilman, I have evidence of misconduct buried under prior administrations. If rooting that out causes discomfort, maybe we should ask why it was hidden." She laid out files. Drake's case, yes, but also a tapestry of covered-up incidents stretching back years. The room grew quieter with each revelation, the weight of her words sinking in. "This isn't about one officer," she finished. "It's about whether we serve everyone or just shield a few at the public's expense." By afternoon, the Bedford Herald dropped a bombshell and expose, under Morton's byline, "Beyond the Badge," a history of hidden complaints. It detailed decades of buried misconduct, including cases tied to Drake's father. Social media erupted. Some cried character assassination. Others demanded a full investigation. In his office, Harrison Wells skimmed the article, his brow creasing. "This shifts things," he told Drake, who sat brooding in a corner. "They're not just after you, they're dismantling the system that propped up officers like you. And your dad." Drake's face darkened, his voice low and venomous. "Then we hit back harder. I've got friends who know dirt on Chenner tactics, her past, Wells shot him a warning look. No, we stick to discrimination. Anything else looks desperate. But Drake's eyes burned with defiance. The media spotlight he'd once wielded now slipping from his grasp. Back in her office, Sarah read Claire's latest text. Grandmother would be proud. Truth is like water, it finds its way. She leaned back, exhaustion tugging at her. But her resolve held firm. The lesson was clear: justice wasn't a straight path, and power misused carried a cost. Bedford would see that cost laid bare, no matter how fiercely the storm raged. The winds of change howled louder now, and soon everyone would have to choose where they stood. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows over the city of Bedford, a storm of revelations brewed within the walls of the police department. Sarah Chen sat in her office, the faint hum of the overhead lights buzzing like the tension in her mind. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers tracing the edges of a notepad filled with scribbled updates from the day. Across from her, James Rodriguez perched on the edge of a desk, his brow furrowed as he spoke in a hushed, urgent tone. "Drake's losing his grip," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many cracks form in a once solid foundation. "His buddies in the department are starting to sweat, especially after that Herald article hit the stands." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line as she nodded, her dark eyes flickering with determination. "Keep your ear to the ground, James. If Drake's cooking something up, I want us ahead of it before it blows up in our faces." Beside her, Captain David Reynolds stood with his arms crossed, his weathered face etched with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. He didn't say much, but his silence spoke volumes. She'd been in this game long enough to know desperation made men dangerous. As night cloaked Bedford in a heavy, inky darkness, both sides of this brewing war took stock of their arsenals. What had started as a scuffle in a dimly lit parking lot had spiraled into something far uglier. Full-blown clash splashed across newspaper headlines and whispered intense conversations. It wasn't just about personal grudges anymore. It was a public reckoning, a raw, unfiltered debate about what justice meant in a city where power had twisted it beyond recognition. Sarah felt the truth clawing its way up from the depths, sharp and relentless like a blade cutting through years of lies. But she knew better than anyone that truth alone wasn't enough. Needed an audience willing to listen, to feel its sting. And Bedford was a town teetering on the edge, its people caught between clinging to the old ways and daring to demand something better. Far across town, in the quiet sanctum of his office, Captain Reynolds sat hunched over his desk, the golden glow of a lone lamp spilling over a chaotic sea of papers. Personnel files, internal memos, and crumpled sticky notes told a story he wished he could unsee, a sprawling web of corruption, woven so deep into the department's bones it made his stomach churn. Each document was a brick in a wall of silence, built to shield men like Michael Drake from the consequences of their actions. A sharp rap at the door jolted him from his thoughts, and he looked up to see Detective Lisa Martinez framed in the doorway, her posture rigid with purpose. In her hand, she clutched a small USB drive, its sleek surface glinting faintly in the low light. "Captain, you've got to see this," she said, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of urgency. "We finally pulled the deleted emails off the old server." Reynolds took the drive with a nod, his thick fingers trembling slightly as he plugged it into his computer. The screen flickered to life, and as he scrolled through the messages, his breath caught in his throat. "Get Chief Chen," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Right now." Within minutes, Sarah strode into the room, her coat still dusted with the chill of the evening air. She joined Reynolds and Martinez at the desk, her sharp eyes scanning the glowing screen. The emails laid bare a chilling truth, a coordinated effort between past department heads and city officials to bury complaints, especially those tied to Drake and his inner circle. Martinez tapped the screen with a manicured nail, pointing to a thread from 3 years back. "Check this out, Drake's traffic stop mess." Former Chief Wilson didn't just suggest altering the reports, he ordered it outright. Sarah's jaw tightened as she read, her mind racing with the implications. "Who else was in on this?" she asked, her tone clipped. Reynolds leaned forward, his chair creaking under his weight. "That's the kicker. Councilman Peters pops up in half a dozen exchanges. tossing out ideas on how to sweep problematic cases under the rug. The revelation hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Peter's loud opposition to her reforms suddenly made sense. He wasn't just defending tradition. He was guarding his own dirty secrets. Meanwhile, in a smoky corner of a rundown bar across town, Michael Drake nursed a whiskey, the amber liquid trembling in his glass as he sat with Officer Thomas Miller and two other grizzled veterans. The air was thick with cigarette haze and the low murmur of conversation, the kind that didn't invite eavesdroppers. Miller leaned in, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Chen's digging too deep, Mike. People are freaking out. Ho's emails are floating around like ghosts now." Drake took a long, slow sip, his eyes narrowing as the burn slid down his throat. "Harrison's telling me to keep my mouth shut, play the discrimination card," he said, his tone dripping with bitterness. "But we've got more dirt on her if we need it." Before he could elaborate, his phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with a text from an unknown number. Parking lot camera caught more than the fight. "Watch yourself." The words sucked the air from his lungs. His mind flashed back to that night, the casual cruelty he'd unleashed on a young Hispanic couple. The way he'd loomed over them, his baton tapping against his palm. It had been a petty power play, forgotten in the chaos of his later clash with Sarah. But the camera hadn't forgotten. The next morning, Sarah's office door creaked open, revealing Robert Torres, a former officer who'd fled to Chicago years ago. He stood there, his broad shoulders hunched, his hands twisting together as if trying to wring out the guilt that haunted him. "I should have come clean sooner," he started, his voice rough with emotion. "What happened to that kid? It wasn't just Drake. It was all of us, the whole damn system. They told us to fall in line or get out." Sarah leaned forward, her gaze steady but warm, urging him on. "We need your testimony, Robert, on the record. You ready for what that'll stir up?" Torres met her eyes, his jaw firming. "My dad came here with nothing, taught me to stand for what's right. I let him down once. Not again." As he spoke, spilling years of buried shame, James darted between phone calls with internal affairs, weaving a net to shield the growing chorus of whistleblowers brave enough to step into the light. But every crack in the wall of silence brought new dangers. Later that day, James burst into Sarah's office, his face flushed with alarm. "We've got a leak. Someone fed the press details on the investigation. Herald's dropping a bomb tomorrow about corruption tying into City Hall." Sarah grabbed her phone, dialing Richard Morton, the paper's editor. "Mr. Morton," she said, cutting through his greeting, "before you print that, there's more you need to know." His voice crackled through the line, skeptical. "If you're trying to kill the story, Chief, no," she snapped. "I'm giving you the full picture. But we've got to play this smart. People's lives are on the line." Across the city, the truth rippled outward, stirring chaos in its wake. In his plush office, Councilman Peters stood over a shredder, its mechanical whine drowning out the pounding of his heart, as strips of paper fluttered to the floor like confetti from a guilty parade. His secretary's voice broke through the noise. "Sir, Captain Reynolds is here." Peters froze, forcing a smile as Reynolds stepped in, a warrant in hand. "Councilman," Reynolds said, his tone flat, "we need to talk about your chats with Chief Wilson." The game was up, and Peter's mask of calm slipped, revealing the panic beneath. That evening, Sarah's phone buzzed with another anonymous tip, this time audio files. She played them in a hushed meeting with James and Reynolds, the grainy voices of Drake and his cronies plotting to smear her filling the room. But the recordings went deeper, exposing ties to officials who'd orchestrated decades of cover-ups. "It's all connected," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. "That parking lot fight was just the loose thread. Now we've got the whole tapestry unraveling." James frowned, his fingers drumming on the table. "These guys won't go quietly, Sarah. They'll fight dirty." She nodded, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. "Bamboo bends, but it doesn't break. Get everything ready for the IA committee," she said. "It's time to lay it all out." As she left the precinct that night, Sarah felt the weight of watchful eyes. Officers lingered in the halls, their faces no longer hardened with defiance, but softened with something new: fear, yes, but also a flicker of respect. Her phone buzzed again, a text from her sister, Claire. Dad says even the old-timers in Chinatown are buzzing about BPD. You're shaking things up, sis. Sarah's lips curved into a faint smile. Shaking things up was an understatement. She was stirring a tidal wave, one strong enough to sweep away the rot and leave the truth gleaming in its wake. In his cramped apartment, Michael Drake sat alone, the glow of his phone casting harsh shadows across his face. He reread the anonymous text about the parking lot footage, his hand trembling as he dialed Harrison Wells. "We need to talk," he said when Wells picked up, his voice tight with dread. "There's something I didn't tell you about that night." The walls were closing in, the double-edged sword of truth slicing through every lie he'd built to protect himself. The morning of the internal review dawned bright and unforgiving, sunlight pouring through the tall windows of the police commission's hearing room. The space was packed, the air thick with anticipation, as Sarah sat at one table with James and Reynolds, her posture calm but unyielding. Across from them, Drake and Harrison Wells whispered tensely, their faces pale under the scrutiny of the crowd. Commission Chairwoman Eleanor Blackwood, a steely former judge, banged her gavel, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "This isn't just about one incident or one officer. Today, we're addressing the rot in Bedford PD's core." Wells rose, his silver hair glinting as he launched into a polished defense, painting Drake as a victim of Sarah's vendetta. But Blackwood cut him off mid-sentence. "Your client attacked his chief. Let's start there." Wells pivoted smoothly, but Sarah could see the cracks in his facade. When her turn came, Sarah stood, her voice clear and unwavering. "I'm not here to spin stories. I'm here with evidence." She nodded to James, who fired up a projector. The room fell silent as the full parking lot footage rolled Drake's harassment of the couple, his simmering rage, every ugly second unedited. "But that's just the beginning," she said, laying out the emails, Torah's testimony, and a litany of buried complaints. "This isn't about one night. It's about a system that shielded the guilty and silenced the rest." Her words hung heavy, a mirror held up to a city that had turned away too long. Justice, Sarah knew, was a blade that cut both ways. For every truth unearthed, there were consequences, some deserved, some devastating. Drake's fall wasn't just his own. It dragged down a network of power that had abused its weight for years. And as the hearing stretched on, the lesson sank in. Unchecked authority festers. But when the light hits it, there's nowhere left to hide. Bedford wasn't just ready, it was waking up. In the dimly lit hearing room, the air buzzed with tension as Drake shifted restlessly in his wooden chair, its creaks echoing faintly against the walls. His fingers gripped the armrests, betraying the storm brewing inside him. Across from him, Sarah stood tall and unwavering, her voice steady as she laid out a relentless cascade of evidence, case after case of misconduct piling up like bricks in a crumbling wall. She recounted the incident with the teenager, a moment Torres had seen with his own eyes, his expression darkening as the memory clawed its way back. When Sarah unveiled evidence of Drake's father mirroring the same corrupt behavior years before, Drake's jaw tightened, his breath catching as if the past had reached out to strangle him. During a brief recess, the atmosphere shifted as Harrison Wells, his face etched with frustration, cornered Drake in a small, sterile conference room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the tiled floor. "Why didn't you tell me about the couple in the parking lot?" Wells snapped, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Do you have any idea how this looks?" Drake's mask of bravado faltered, his shoulders slumping as he muttered, "It wasn't important. Everyone does it." Wells' eyes narrowed, his tone sharp enough to slice through steel. "Everyone does it. That's your excuse." The words hung heavy, a judgment Drake couldn't escape. And he turned away, staring at the blank wall as if it might offer an answer. When the hearing resumed, the room seemed to shrink under the weight of anticipation. Chairwoman Blackwood, her presence commanding behind the polished oak table, called an unexpected name, Officer Jenny Parker. The rookie stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her uniform. She darted a nervous glance at Drake, who sat rigid, his eyes boring into her as if willing her to stop. "Officer Parker," Blackwood began, her voice calm yet piercing, "please share your experiences since joining the department." Jenny swallowed hard, her voice quivering at first, but gaining strength. I was assigned to Officer Drake's unit for training. He told me there were unwritten rules. Certain complaints didn't need to be reported, especially in some neighborhoods. Her words landed like stones, each one rippling through the room, stirring whispers among the attendees. The testimony snowballed as more voices joined the chorus. Detective Martinez, a weary man with sharp eyes, took the floor, his charts and graphs painting a damning picture of selective enforcement and discriminatory practices. His hands moved with precision, pointing to spikes in the data that screamed of injustice. Captain Reynolds followed, his gruff voice recounting decades of buried incidents reports altered, evidence lost, truths smothered under layers of loyalty. As Martinez spoke, Wells slipped a note to Drake, the paper rustling faintly. "We need to consider options," it read. Drake's fist closed around it, crumpling it into a tight ball, his knuckles whitening as rage and fear battled within him. Near the day's end, Blackwood's gaze settled on Drake, her eyes like twin beacons cutting through the haze. "Officer Drake, do you wish to respond to these allegations?" He rose, brushing off Wells' outstretched hand, his chest heaving with barely contained fury. "You want the truth?" He spat, his voice taut and raw. "Everything I did, I learned from the officers before me. Chief Chen preaches change, but she doesn't get it. She doesn't know what it means to be a real cop in this city." Blackwood leaned forward, her tone deceptively soft. "And what does being a real cop mean, Officer Drake?" He barreled on, reckless now. "It means knowing who the real troublemakers are. It means protecting our own. It means—" He stopped, the weight of his own words crashing down as gasps rippled through the room. "Please, continue," Blackwood urged quietly. "Who are these real troublemakers?" Silence swallowed the moment, thick and suffocating. Drake sank back into his seat, his career unraveling with every echo of his confession. Sarah watched from her place, her heart a tangle of resolve and sorrow. There was no triumph in this, only a quiet certainty that this rupture was the first step toward healing. The commission deliberated for hours, the clock ticking relentlessly as shadows lengthened across the room. When they returned, Blackwood's face was a mask of solemnity. "This hearing has exposed a web of misconduct stretching far beyond one man," she declared, her voice resonating with authority. "Officer Drake's immediate termination is merely the starting point. We recommend a full departmental audit and an oversight committee to overhaul every policy and procedure." Turning to Sarah, she added, "Chief Chen, you will spearhead this reform with unrestricted authority." The room buzzed with murmurs, but Sarah remained still, the gravity of her task settling like a mantle on her shoulders. Drake stormed out, his footsteps thundering down the hall, deaf to Wells' pleas to wait. That evening, in the quiet of her office, Sarah sat behind her desk, the city's skyline sprawling beyond the window. A soft knock broke her reverie, and Officer Thomas Miller stepped in, his lined face weary under the dim light. "Chief," he began, his voice rough with years of wear, "I've been thinking about retiring. Maybe it's time for us old dogs to step aside." Sarah studied him, seeing the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Or maybe," she countered gently, "it's time to learn new ways to serve. The choice is yours." "Thomas," he nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in as he retreated into the night. Outside, darkness draped Bedford, and Sarah stood at her window, the city lights twinkling like stars against the void. Her phone buzzed, a message from Claire lighting up the screen. "Grandmother always said justice is like the sunnet, might hide behind clouds, but it never stops shining." The hearing was over, but the real fight loomed ahead, new obstacles, new resistance. Yet for tonight, truth had clawed its way into the open, fragile but fierce. A week later, Michael Drake sat alone in his cramped apartment, the air thick with the stale scent of coffee and regret. Newspaper clippings littered the table, headlines screaming of his downfall, while empty mugs stacked up like monuments to sleepless nights. His phone lay silent, abandoned by former allies who now kept their distance after his catastrophic testimony. The TV hummed in the background, another report on the Bedford Police Department's reforms droning on. A sharp knock jolted him, and he opened the door to find James Rodriguez standing there, his expression unreadable. "Chief Chen wants to talk," James said simply. Drake laughed, a bitter edge to it. "Haven't you people taken enough? James didn't flinch. This isn't about taking. It's about fixing things. At the precinct, Sarah waited in her office. A thick folder labeled Community Oversight Implementation opened before her. When Drake entered, she noticed the change immediately, once proud swagger replaced by a hollowed-out weariness. "Sit down, Michael," she said, her use of his first name softening the air between them. "If this is some victory lap," he started, but she cut him off. "It's not. I want to show you something." She slid another folder across the desk, revealing black and white photos of officers from the 1960s, their faces stern against a backdrop of protest signs. "These were taken during the civil rights movement," she explained. "This officer here, he started out fighting integration. By the end, he was one of its biggest champions in the department." Drake stared, silent, the images stirring something deep. "People can change, Michael," Sarah pressed. "More than that, they can help others change." He met her gaze, suspicion flaring. What are you getting at?" She leaned forward, her voice steady. "I've reviewed your early records, before your father's shadow took over. You were different then. Your community engagement was outstanding." Drake shifted, discomfort etching his features. "That was a lifetime ago. It doesn't have to stay buried." She countered. "You've got two paths: fight your termination, drag this through the courts, or help us rebuild. Help yourself." His laugh was sharp, disbelieving. "Me, after you made me the poster boy for your reforms?" "No," she said firmly. "You're someone who knows the old system inside out, though it worked, why it's broken." As Sarah outlined her plan, Drake working with internal affairs to root out corruption, using his experience to shape reform. She's skepticism softened into something like curiosity. "Why trust me?" he asked, his voice low. "Because sometimes the ones who've seen the wreckage up close make the best builders," she replied. Across town, Captain Reynolds gathered Officer Jenny Parker and a handful of young officers who'd testified, their faces a mix of hope and nerves. "The chief's rolling out new training," he said, his gruff tone softened by purpose. "We need your ideas on what's broken." Jenny hesitated, then spoke. "What about Drake? Some say he's been back at the precinct." Reynolds nodded. "He's working with Ia. People can surprise you." Meanwhile, Detective Martinez hunched over her desk, reviewing cold cases with James Rodriguez when her computer pinged. "Chief needs to see this," she said, pulling up an email. Drake had sent detailed notice, names, dates, locations, exposing 3 senior officers who'd buried misconduct for years. James scanned it, whistling low. "He's not pulling punches." In her office, Sarah pored over Drake's report, his insider knowledge illuminating the department's darkest corners. "There's more," he said, pointing to specific entries. "This wasn't random. It was a machine built over decades. My father, others, they taught us how to bend the rules, how to shield each other no matter the cost." His voice cracked, shame warring with resolve. "I'm not proud of it, but maybe I can stop it from happening again." The shift wasn't instant. Some officers sneered at Drake, branding him a turncoat or a ghost of their tarnished past. But others, especially the rookies, began to listen. During a community engagement training, he faced a room of fresh faces, their eyes wide with curiosity. "I used to think power was about control," he told them, his voice steady but raw. "Now I see it's about responsibility. This badge isn't armor, it's a promise we have to keep earning." Sarah watched from the back, noting the nods, the way his words landed heavy with the weight of experience. Justice, she thought, wasn't just punishment, it was the hard, messy work of building something better from the ruins of arrogance and abuse. And as the city hummed beyond her window, she knew the lesson was clear. Power unchecked breeds rot, but accountability could turn even the fallen into architects of change. The late afternoon sun dipped low over Bedford, casting long, golden shadows across the precinct parking lot as Sarah Chen stepped outside, her boots crunching softly against the gravel. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she barely noticed, her mind still reeling from an unexpected call she'd received earlier that day. The voice on the other end had been Chairwoman Blackwood's, crisp and authoritative, yet laced with a rare hint of warmth. "Your reform programs are showing promising results, Chief Chen," she'd said, her words lingering in Sarah's ears like an echo she couldn't shake. Though I'll confess, leveraging someone like Drake as a resource caught me off guard. Sarah had paused before responding, her fingers tightening around the receiver. Sometimes, she'd replied thoughtfully, the most effective way to tear down a flawed system is to enlist the help of someone who knows its cracks intimately. Someone who helped lay its foundation. The call had ended abruptly, leaving Sarah staring at the silent phone, a mix of pride and unease swirling in her chest. As she hung up, she'd barely had a moment to process the conversation when a shadow fell across her office doorway. She looked up to see Michael Drake standing there, his broad frame filling the space, his expression unreadable. His dark eyes met hers, and without preamble, he spoke, his voice low and steady. That Hispanic couple from the parking lot that night have been thinking about them. I want to apologize to them in person. The words hit Sarah like a sudden gust of wind, stirring a storm of emotions within her. She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for sincerity. Drake, once the poster child of the old guard, a man who'd wielded power like a blunt instrument, now stood before her with something akin to remorse flickering in his gaze. She nodded slowly, her decision settling into place like a stone dropping into still water. I'll make it happen, she said simply, her tone firm but not unkind. That evening, as Sarah left the precinct, the sky was ablaze with hues of orange and pink, the sun sinking below the horizon like a weary traveler laying down to rest. She crossed the parking lot, her footsteps echoing in the quiet, when a familiar voice called out behind her. Chief, she turned to see Drake jogging to catch up, his breath visible in the crisp air. It was the very spot where their paths had first collided months ago, a confrontation born of clashing ideals, a raw and jagged moment that had set everything in motion. He stopped a few feet away, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. Thank you, he said, his voice carrying a weight she hadn't heard before, for seeing something in me worth saving. Sarah paused, the words sinking into her like roots, taking hold in soft earth. She tilted her head, her dark hair catching the last rays of daylight. Everyone deserves a shot at redemption, Michael, she replied, her voice steady but laced with quiet conviction. The real question is what we choose to do with that chance. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from the moment. She glanced at the screen at text from her sister, Claire. Grandmother used to say the strongest bridges are built by those who've walked both sides of the divide. Sarah smiled faintly, tucking the phone away as she continued toward her car. The words resonated deeply, mirroring her own reflections as she considered how far they'd come. The Bedford Police Department was evolving, inch by painstaking inch. Change was slow, like a river carving its way through stone, but it was undeniable. And often, she mused, the most potent catalysts for that change were the ones who'd once stood in its way, people like Drake, whose transformation was as unexpected as it was profound. 3 months into the reform program, the precinct bore little resemblance to its former self. Gone were the faded bulletin boards plastered with grim wanted posters. In their place hung neatly printed schedules for community engagement events and detailed accountability metrics, their bright colors a stark contrast to the peeling paint of the past. The air inside felt different too, still charged, but with the electric hum of progress rather than the stifling weight of resistance. Sarah stood at the front of the briefing room, her posture straight, her dark eyes sweeping over the assembled officers. Starting next week, she announced, her voice cutting through the murmurs, every patrol unit will include a community liaison officer. These aren't optional tag-alongs, they're a cornerstone of our new approach. The room shifted slightly, a ripple of unease passing through the ranks. In the back row, Officer Thomas Miller fidgeted, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. A veteran of nearly 2 decades, he wore his discomfort like an ill-fitting uniform. The changes gnawed at him, tugging at the edges of a career built on rigid routines and unquestioned authority. Yet, unlike the early days when he'd stewed in silent defiance, he raised a hand, his gravelly voice breaking the tension. Chief, with all due respect, won't this slow us down out there? Sarah welcomed the question, a flicker of appreciation lighting her expression. It was a far cry from the stony silence they'd once faced. Good question, Officer Miller, she replied, stepping forward. The data says otherwise. Departments using this model show faster, More effective responses when officers know the communities they serve. Understanding the people makes decisions sharper, not slower. From the side of the room, Drake chimed in, his tone casual but edged with hard-earned insight. I used to think like you, Tom, but think about how many calls turned into messes because we didn't get the context. Miller's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue, his eyes narrowing as he weighed Drake's words. The exchange hung in the air, a small but significant crack in the wall of resistance. The rollout wasn't seamless. Some officers, unable to bend with the shifting tide, handed in their badges and walked away, their footsteps echoing down the precinct halls like a fading drumbeat. Others, like young officer Jenny Parker, threw themselves into the reforms with a zeal that bordered on infectious. Her bright eyes sparkled with purpose as she volunteered for extra shifts, her voice ringing out during briefings with ideas and questions. Captain Reynolds, a grizzled figure with salt and pepper hair, took charge of the new training programs, his deep voice steady as he worked alongside community leaders to craft modules on cultural competency. This isn't just about dodging screw-ups, he told his team one morning, sunlight streaming through the briefing room windows. It's about forging real team connections that last. One crisp morning, as Sarah sat at her desk reviewing reports, the door creaked open to reveal Councilman Peters, his suit impeccable but his expression guarded. Recently back from administrative levy and investigation still looming over him. Like a dark cloud as stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking against the tile. You've certainly stirred the pot, Chief Chen, he said, his tone carefully measured. Neither warm nor cold. Sarah leaned back in her chair, meeting his gaze evenly. Change was overdue, Councilman. You can either help steer it or get swept up in it. Peter's lips twitched, not quite a smile, and he gave a slow nod. The council's voting on your budget expansion for the community programs soon. You might be surprised by the support you've gained. His words lingered as he left, a subtle shift in the political winds Sarah hadn't anticipated. The transformation reached beyond policies, seeping into the precinct's very bones. Interview rooms, once sterile and foreboding with their harsh lights and bare walls, were softened with neutral tones and comfortable chairs, designed to ease rather than intimidate. The lobby now boasted a community meeting space, its tables cluttered with flyers and coffee cups from local gatherings. Even the walls bore new leaf-vibrant murals painted by children from Bedford's schools, their colors a quiet rebellion against the grayness of the past. Detective Rosa Martinez, a sharp-eyed woman with a quick smile, led a new unit dedicated to community police relations. We're not just here to uphold laws, she told her team during a morning huddle, her voice firm with conviction. We're here to earn trust, one conversation at a time. James Rodriguez, a weary officer with a knack for logistics, became the department's unofficial ambassador, coordinating with police forces nationwide. Chief, he reported one afternoon, his excitement barely contained. We're getting calls from departments across the country. They want the playbook on how Bedford's pulling this off. Sarah nodded, her mind racing. The answer wasn't simple. It wasn't just about new rules or shiny initiatives. It was a seismic shift in mindset, often driven by the unlikeliest of allies like Drake, who'd once embodied everything she'd fought against. At a community forum one evening, Drake stood before a packed room of residents, his hands clasped tightly as he spoke. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on his face. I was part of the problem, he admitted, his voice raw with honesty. But Chief Chen and this department showed me there's a better way to surveillance-protect. Sarah watched from the sidelines, her arms crossed, as the man who'd once been her adversary became a voice for change. Even Officer Miller, once Drake's staunchest defender in the old ways, had begun to shift. Now leading sensitivity training sessions, he cracked a rare grin during one class. They say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, he quipped, his gruff voice softening. Well, watch me prove I'm wrong. The numbers began to tell the story. Complaints plummeted, while positive interactions with the community soared. Response times, despite Miller's early fears, sharpened as officers leaned on newfound trust and local knowledge. One quiet afternoon, Sarah found a handwritten note slipped under her office door from Jenny Parker. Chief, remember when I was too scared to speak up? Today, I taught new recruits about moral courage. Thank you for showing us what it looks like." Sarah traced the words with her finger, a swell of pride mixing with the weight of responsibility. But the road wasn't without its potholes. Some residents, their faith in the police eroded by years of missteps, eyed the changes with suspicion, their arms crossed and their voices sharp at town halls. Sarah faced them head-on during a leadership meeting, her tone resolute. "We're not chasing quick wins or flashy headlines. We're laying a new bedrock for policing in Bedford's low, messy, and absolutely essential." The local press, once split down the middle, began to tilt toward cautious optimism. The Bedford Herald launched a series, Policing in Partnership, spotlighting moments of collaboration, a traffic stop turned community dialogue, a patrol officer helping fix a kid's bike. Even Harrison Wells, Drake's former attorney, grudgingly conceded at a bar association dinner. What's happening here could set a national standard. One evening, as Sarah crossed the parking lot, transformed with a small community garden, its rows of tomatoes and marigolds tended by officers and residents alike. Her phone buzzed with another message from Claire. "Grandmother would love this. She always said true strength isn't standing alone, it's lifting others up with you." Sarah paused, her gaze settling on Jenny Parker kneeling in the dirt, showing a group of kids how to plant seeds, while Miller chatted with shop owners about security. A quiet smile tugged at her lips. This was change, not loud showdowns, but the steady rhythm of daily choices to do better. 6 months in, Sarah sat in her office. The final reform report spread across her desk like a map of a hard-fought journey. It cataloged more than policy shifts, it laid bare the human toll. Careers had crumbled, friendships fractured, lives reshaped. Drake's story filled pages, his cooperation a linchpin of the reforms, but the cost was steep. Old buddies now avoided his gaze on the street, and his father, a retired cop with a stern jaw and sterner principles, hadn't spoken to him since he'd testified. "Doing what's right doesn't come cheap," he'd told Sarah during his last consulting session, his voice thick with emotion. "But that doesn't make the ache any easier." The fallout rippled outward. Councilman Peters resigned before the investigation could bury him, his polished facade cracking under scrutiny. 3 senior officers opted for early retirement, their past misdeeds dragged into the light. Judge Wells, once untouchable, found his name whispered with disdain in legal circles. Even Sarah felt the strain. Claire had noticed it over their weekly dinners, her brow furrowing as she watched her sister. "You carry it differently now," she'd said one night, stirring her coffee. "The weight, I mean," Sarah sighed, her fork pausing midair. "Someone has to," she replied, thinking of the officers and residents depending on her to see this through. The younger ranks weren't spared either. Jenny Parker, for all her enthusiasm, faced cold shoulders from peers who branded her a turncoat. "They'll come around," James Rodriguez assured her one tough day, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Change takes time." Captain Reynolds, now heading the Professional Standards Division, felt the chill-tooled academy buddies stopped calling, and his wife bristled at the snubs from police spouses. 25 years on the job," he told Sarah late one night, the precinct quiet around them. "And only now do I feel like I'm doing it right." Detective Martinez wrestled with her own battles, her unclay 30-year veteran rumbling at family gatherings about soft policing. She'd bite her tongue, but the tension gnawed at her. Yet amid the costs, lessons emerged sharp and unyielding. Justice, Sarah realized, wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was about building something better from the wreckage. Power, when abused, left scars that lingered for generations, but when wielded with care, it could mend what was broken. Drake's apology to the Hispanic couple came on a rainy afternoon, their wary eyes softening as he spoke, his voice trembling with regret. Miller's gruff training sessions turned rookies into listeners, not just enforcers. Jenny's quiet courage inspired a new wave of officers to question, to care. And Sarah, standing in that garden as dusk settled over Bedford, saw the truth. Real change wasn't a single victory, it was 1,000 small acts, each one a defiance of the past, each one a step toward a future where justice wasn't a weapon, but a promise. The air in the staff meeting room hung heavy with tension as Sarah Chen stood before her colleagues, her voice steady but laced with quiet defiance. The NYPD says we're tearing down police tradition, she declared, her eyes scanning the sea of uniforms, some nodding in reluctant agreement, others bristling with unease. But I told him tradition isn't always right. Her words landed like stones in a still pond, rippling through the room. She could feel the weight of history pressing against her, the unspoken loyalty to a system that had shaped so many lives, including her own. Yet, she refused to let it bind her to silence. For Sarah, this wasn't just about challenging the past, it was about carving out a future where justice wasn't a hollow word. In the shadow of that confrontation, an unexpected alliance began to take root. The Ramirez family, a Hispanic couple caught in the crosshairs of a chaotic parking lot incident months earlier, had every reason to turn their backs on the police. The memory of that night still haunted Sarah, flashing lights cutting through the dusk, the shouts echoing off concrete, the fear etched into Mrs. Ramirez's face as her husband was pinned to the ground. Officer Michael Drake, then a staunch defender of the old ways, had been the one to escalate it. But now, after his halting, heartfelt apology delivered on their doorstep one rainy afternoon, something shifted. The Ramirezes didn't just accept his words, they chose to step forward. They agreed to join the community police dialogue sessions, their voices trembling at first but growing steadier with each meeting. Mrs. Ramirez, a woman with dark eyes that held both sorrow and strength, stood before a circle of officers one evening, her hands clasped tightly as she spoke. "Forgiveness isn't about erasing what happened," she said, her voice cutting through the room's unease. "It's about making room for something better, for change." Her husband, Miguel, nodded beside her, his quiet presence a pillar of support. To Sarah, they weren't just participants. They were proof that bridges could be built from the wreckage of mistrust. Meanwhile, Thomas Miller, a grizzled veteran with 30 years on the force, watched his familiar world unravel. The precinct he'd known a fortress of rigid routines. An unspoken codice was crumbling under the weight of reform. Once a skeptic who'd scoffed at Sarah's ideas, Miller now found himself standing at a crossroads. The training session that day had been grueling, the room thick with the sweat and frustration of officers grappling with new protocols. He stepped forward, his voice rough but resolute. "We were wrong," he admitted, the words tasting bitter as they left his mouth. Not just about that night in the parking lot, but about everything their whole damn approach. His confession hung in the air, a raw acknowledgement that stunned the younger recruits. For Miller, the hardest part wasn't the admission itself. It was the slow, painful unraveling of his identity as a cop, and the even harder task of stitching it back together into something new. He became an unlikely mediator, his gray hair and weathered hands a bridge between the old guard and the fresh faces, eager for a different way. Each day, he felt the tug of nostalgia warring with the pull of purpose, and he chose the latter. The financial toll of these changes was no small matter. The department's budget, once a predictable ledger of overtime and equipment costs, was now a battleground. New training programs demanded hours of instruction on de-escalation and cultural sensitivity, while community initiatives required spaces, staff, and supplies. City council meetings turned into verbal sparring matches, with some members clutching their calculators like lifelines. "This is too expensive," one councilman barked, his face flushed with indignation. Sarah, standing at the podium, didn't flinch. "You can't put a price tag on trust," she shot back, her voice firm but threaded with passion. "But you can damn well measure what it costs when it's gone lawsuits, protests, lives lost." Her words silenced the room, if only for a moment. She thought of the Ramirez family, of Miller's quiet transformation, of the officers who'd begun to see their badges differently. To her, every dollar spent was an investment in a future where justice wasn't just enforced but earned. One evening, as the precinct hummed with the soft buzz of late-night paperwork, Sarah found Drake waiting in her office. He stood by her desk, a letter clutched in his hand. His broad shoulders slouched with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. "Chicago PD reached out," he said, setting the paper down with a faint thud. "They want me to consult on their reform program," words spreading about what we've done here. Sarah studied him, the lines on his face deeper now, carved by months of reckoning. Once her fiercest adversary, Drake had become an anchor in this storm of change. His eyes met hers, searching for something, permissions, perhaps, or reassurance. "Will you take it?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. He paused, then nodded. "I think I have to. What we started here reaches bigger than Bedford. It needs to spread." As he spoke, Sarah felt a pang of loss, but also pride. Drake's journey wasn't just about redemption. It was a living lesson in the cost of accountability and the power of owning one's mistakes. For Sarah, the price of reform wasn't just professional, it seeped into every corner of her life. Her sister Claire, a sharp-tongued nurse with a knack for cutting through Sarah's defenses, became her lifeline. Late one night, as the precinct clock ticked past midnight, Claire stormed in, her coat still damp from the rain. "Grandmother didn't claw her way out of a revolution just for you to work yourself into an early grave," she scolded, shoving a takeout container of dumplings into Sarah's hands. Sarah laughed, a rare sound these days, but the exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. Her apartment sat empty most nights, her social life a distant memory. Every waking moment was consumed by the fight for change, and though she'd never admit it, the loneliness gnawed at her. Yet Claire's fierce love and her insistence on small acts of care kept Sarah grounded, a reminder that even warriors needed to rest. The fruits of their labor were undeniable. Community trust metrics, once a grim tally of suspicion, began to climb steadily. Minority recruits, who'd long seen the badge as a barrier rather than a beacon, stayed on in growing numbers. Civilian complaints dwindled, replaced by stories of successful intervention softwares mediating disputes, partnering with local groups, listening instead of commanding. The Bedford Herald, once a chorus of doubt, published an editorial that captured the shift, the price and promise of police reform. Its pages detailed the rocky road they'd travel at, the budget fights, the resistance, the sleepless nights, but also the victories. Like the parking lot now blooming with flower beds and laughter instead of sirens and shouts. For Sarah, reading it felt like holding a mirror to her soul, reflecting both the scars and the hope. At a department-wide meeting, Sarah stood before her officers, the weight of their shared journey pressing against her chest. "Change isn't just about policies or procedures," she said, her voice carrying a quiet fire. "It's about choices, hard ones that ripple through real lives. We've all paid something for this time, pride, comfort, but the cost of doing nothing, that would have buried us." Her gaze swept the room, landing on Officer Jenny Parker, a young woman whose sharp mind and steady hands had earned her respect. Later, as Sarah left the precinct, she caught sight of Parker in the parking lot, a vibrant community space teaching recruits, under the glow of string lights. "The badge means something different now," Parker was saying, her voice firm with conviction. "It's not about power, it's about responsibility." Nearby, Miller leaned against a picnic table, chatting with residents about potholes and school safety, his laughter mingling with theirs. 6 months ago, this scene would have been a fantasy. Now, it was a fragile, beautiful reality. Her phone buzzed as she walked to her car. A message from Drake lighting up the screen. Chicago confirmed. "Thanks for showing me redemption's possible, even when it costs everything." Sarah paused, staring at the precinct's silhouette against the dusk. Claire's words from their last dinner echoed in her mind. Grandmother always said, "Nothing valuable comes without sacrifice. The question is whether it's worth it." Looking at the transformed department, lives touched. The trust rebuilt, Sarah knew it was. The price had been steep, but what they'd gained was beyond measure. A year later, Sarah stood at a podium during the Bedford Police Department's annual community ceremony. The crowd before her, a tapestry of face officers, residents, leaders all woven together by a year of relentless effort. "A year ago," she began, her voice steady but thick with emotion, "we faced a choice, cling to a rotting system or fight for something better. Today, we're living proof that change isn't just a dream, it's a decision." In the front row, James Rodriguez, a young officer with a quick smile, sat beside Captain Reynolds, both now architects of a training program hailed across the country. Behind them, Sergeant Jenny Parker, newly promoted, embodied the next wave of leadership years, compassionate, unafraid. Michael Drake took the stage next, fresh from his work in Chicago, his presence stirring whispers. Some still saw him as a relic of the old guard, others a testament to transformation. "What we've done here isn't about rules," he said, his voice rough with honesty. "It's about owning our failures and proving change starts with us. The numbers back them up. Use of force incidents down 60%. Trust ratings doubled. Retention soaring among minority officers." Thomas Miller, now leading a mentorship program for veterans, stepped forward, his chest swelling with a pride he hadn't felt in decades. "I've worn this badge 30 years, he said, "and I've never been prouder than I am now." Detective Martinez followed, her passion igniting the room, as she shared stories of community partnerships to Ramirez's family's journey. "Now a blueprint for healing. We're not just cops anymore," she said. "We're neighbors." After the ceremony, Sarah walked the precinct with Claire, who'd flown in to witness the milestone. They paused by the community garden, its soil rich with new roots. "Remember what grandmother said about bamboo?" Claire asked, her eyes gleaming. "It grows slow at first, building strength below the surface." Sarah nodded, watching Parker guide a youth group through the facility. "But once it breaks through," Claire finished, "nothing stops it." The metaphor felt alive here. In the precinct's quiet hum of purpose, in the parking lot where shadows had given way to light, Sarah knew the work wasn't done. Akalanges loomed, resistance lingered, but Bedford was ready. Justice, she realized, wasn't a destination. It was a promise, kept alive by every step forward, no matter the cost. "It seems like you've shared an engaging and detailed narrative about the transformation of the Bedford Police Department," followed by a tense scene introducing Marcus Davis and Officer Dan Holloway in a diner. The first part reflects on leadership, redemption, and community-driven change, while the second part sets up a dramatic encounter hinting at undercover work and simmering conflict. "I'm not entirely sure what you're asking me to do with this. Did you want me to analyze it, continue the story, or provide feedback? Since you haven't posed a specific question, I'll assume you'd like my thoughts on it and an invitation to clarify your intent." The Bedford Police Department story is a compelling exploration of reform and personal growth. Sarah Chen's evolution from a challenged chief to a transformative leader is inspiring, emphasizing courage and empathy as key to change. Michael Drake's arc complements this beautifully. A shift from resistance to advocacy adds depth, showing that transformation isn't just top-down but can happen within individuals too. The imagery of bamboo breaking ground is a powerful metaphor for unstoppable, organic growth, tying the narrative together nicely. The reflective tone and call to the audience to share their own experiences make it feel like a motivational piece, perhaps from a video script or a blog post, which works well to provoke thought. The diner scene with Marcus and Dan shifts gears into a suspenseful, character-driven moment. Marcus's calm under pressure contrasts sharply with Dan's aggressive posturing, creating instant tension. The detail, like the sketchbook, the waitress's nervous hovering, and the diner's collective unease, paints a vivid picture. It's intriguing that Marcus is undercover, and his subtle confidence suggests he's holding a trump card, while Dan's authority feels brittle, driven by ego rather than insight. This sets up a classic power struggle with an unpredictable edge, leaving me curious about how Marcus's assignment and Dan's suspicions will collide. If you'd like me to expand on either part, analyze specific elements, e.g., character motivations, themes, or even search for real-world parallels on X or the web, just let me know. What were you hoping to explore with this? Your thoughts or next steps would help me assist you better. The air in the diner hung heavy, thick with the scent of burnt coffee and the faint tang of grease from the kitchen. Officer Dan Holloway stood over the table, his broad shoulders squared with a confidence that felt more like a performance than a conviction. In his hand, he twirled Marcus Davis's ID, his thumb brushing over the edges as if testing its authenticity. His lips curled into a smirk, a crooked little twist that hinted at amusement, though his eyes gleamed with something sharper, something predatory. "Marcus Davis," he drawled, letting the name roll off his tongue like he was savoring it. "Pretty ordinary name, huh? You got anything on your record I should know about, Mr. Davis?" His voice carried a taunting lilt, as if he already knew the answer and was daring Marcus to prove him wrong. Marcus sat still, his broad hands resting on the table, fingers splayed near a well-worn sketchpad. He didn't flinch, didn't shift in his seat. His silence wasn't defiance not yet, but a quiet refusal to play Dan's game. The officer's smirk faltered for a split second, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He turned abruptly, his boots scuffing the linoleum floor, and fixed his gaze on a patron sitting nearby, a man in his 50s, hunched over a chipped coffee mug. The man's knuckles whitened as he gripped the handle, his shoulders drawing inward like he wished he could vanish into the cracked vinyl of the booth. "You," Dan barked, jabbing a finger in his direction. "You seen this guy around here before? Ever catch him doing anything strange?" The man's eyes darted to Marcus, then back to his coffee, as if the dark liquid might hold an escape route. He shook his head quickly, the motion jerky and nervous. "No, sir," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "He just draws, that's all. Real good, too. Did that big mural down by City Hall." His words spilled out in a rush, like he hoped they'd appease Dan and end the interrogation. But Dan scoffed, a sharp, dismissive sound that sliced through the quiet. "City Hall, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Guess even crooks need a day job." At the counter, the waitress Ellie, her name tag red-shifted her weight, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the floor. She'd been hovering there, a damp rag twisted in her hands, her brow furrowed with a mix of worry and frustration. She'd known Marcus for years, watched him sit in that same corner booth sketching strangers and sipping black coffee, always leaving a generous tip despite his quiet demeanor. Now, her patience snapped. "Officer Holloway," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "you've got the wrong idea about Marcus. He's a regular here and never caused a lick of trouble." Dan whipped around, his eyes narrowing as if she'd just thrown a punch. "Did I ask for your opinion?" he snapped, his words cutting like a blade. "Stay out of this." Ellie flinched, her cheeks flushing, but she held her ground, her fingers tightening around the rag until her knuckles matched the white of the counter. Marcus leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms over his chest. The diner had fallen so still that the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, like a swarm of restless bees. Every pair of ice patrons, staff, even the cook peeking through the kitchen pass-through locked onto the scene unfolding before them. Marcus let the silence stretch, a heavy, deliberate pause that seemed to press against Dan's bravado. Then, finally, he spoke. "You seem real set on turning this into something it's not," he said, his voice low and steady, each word chosen with care. "Why's that?" Dan's smirk returned, though it wobbled, less sure than before. He straightened up, puffing out his chest as if to reclaim the authority he felt slipping. "Why?" he echoed, his tone sharp but hollow. "Let's just say I've got a knack for sniffing out trouble. You think I can't spot it a mile away?" His eyes glinted with a challenge, daring Marcus to push back. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes studying Dan like an artist examining a flawed canvas. "Trouble," he repeated, letting the word linger in the air, tasting its weight. He didn't rush to fill the silence that followed, forcing Dan to squirm in it. The officer shifted his weight, his boots creaking again, and muttered, "Look, it's not personal. Just doing my job keeping this place safe." Marcus nodded slowly, his face unreadable, a mask of calm that hid the storm of thoughts churning beneath. "Safe," he said, his voice soft but piercing. "And what does safe look like to you?" The question landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the room. Dan blinked, caught off guard, his mouth opening and closing as if the answer had slipped out of reach. "Safe looks like people who belong here," he stammered. "People who don't stick out." "Stick out," Marcus echoed, leaning forward just enough to close the space between them. His tone wasn't sharp, wasn't accusing, but it carried a gravity that pinned Dan in place. Like an artist in a diner with a sketch pad, Dan's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides, but no words came. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes, a crack in the armor of his confidence. Marcus pressed on, his voice rising just enough to reach every corner of the diner. "Or maybe," he said, pausing for effect, "it looks like a cop making assumptions about someone because of the color of their skin." The room seemed to inhale as one, a collective gasp swallowed by the weight of his words. Dan's face flushed crimson, his breath hitching as he scrambled to regain control. "That's not what this is about," he snapped, but the defensiveness in his voice betrayed him, ringing false against the truth Marcus had laid bare. Marcus leaned back again, his calm unshaken, a quiet strength radiating from him. "If you say so," he said simply, letting the words hang like a mirror Dan couldn't escape. Ellie took a tentative step forward, her courage bolstered by the shift she felt in the air. "Officer," she said, her voice steadier now, "maybe you should let Marcus finish his coffee. He's not bothering his soul." Dan rounded on her, his frustration boiling over. "You don't tell me how to do my job, miss," he growled, his voice loud enough to rattle the salt shakers on the tables. But his outburst only fanned the flames. The patrons, once hesitant, now stirred with a quiet resolve. A man by the window, a grizzled regular named Tom, with a beard streaked gray and arms thick from years of manual labor, stood up, crossing his arms. "Why don't you leave the guy alone?" he said, his voice gruff but steady. "He's not doing anything wrong." Another voice piped up from the back, a young woman with a toddler tugging at her sleeve. "Yeah, he's just sitting there, minding his own business. Why are you hassling him?" Whispers of agreement spread like wildfire, a low hum of disapproval that filled the diner. Dan's face darkened, his confidence crumbling as he glanced around, realizing the tide had turned against him. Marcus watched it all unfold, his expression serene, but his eyes sharp, taking in every detail. The way Tom squared his shoulders, the way Ellie's hands trembled but didn't retreat, the way the room itself seemed to close ranks around him. He could see the cracks widening in Dan's facade, the officer's pride warring with the dawning reality that he'd overplayed his hand. The tension thickened, a palpable force that pressed against the walls, and Marcus knew the next move was his. Dan flipped Marcus's ID over in his hand again, his fingers digging into the plastic as if he could squeeze out some hidden guilt. Finding nothing, he slapped it back onto the table with a force that made the coffee mugs tremble. "No priors, huh?" he said, his voice thick with skepticism. "Guess today's your lucky day." Marcus reached for the ID, sliding it back into his wallet with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed to mock Dan's aggression. "Lucky," he murmured, as if rolling the word around in his mind. He met Dan's gaze, unflinching. "Is that what you think this is?" Dan ignored the question, his eyes darting to the sketch pad on the table. Without a word, he snatched it up, flipping through the pages with rough, careless hands. Each sketch was a marvel cityscapes that breathed with life, portraits so vivid they seemed to stare back, scenes of everyday beauty captured in strokes of genius. He paused on one page, a vibrant depiction of the mural at City Hall, a tapestry of faces from every corner of the community. The signature at the bottom read M. Davis in a bold, confident scrawl. Dan's hands stilled, a flicker of recognition crossing his face, but he quickly buried it beneath a scoff. "M. Davis, that's you?" he asked, his voice laced with doubt, as if he couldn't reconcile the man before him with the artist who'd painted a city landmark. Marcus didn't answer right away. He let the question dangle, a quiet challenge that forced Dan to stew in his own uncertainty. "What do you think?" he said at last, his tone even but edged with something unyielding. Dan's lips thinned, and he shoved the sketch pad back onto the table, the pages fluttering like startled birds. "Doesn't change anything," he muttered, his voice tighter now. "Doesn't mean you're not up to something." Ellie stepped forward again, her resolve hardened by the murmurs of support around her. "Officer, that mural's famous," she said, her words ringing with pride. "Marcus painted it as one of the most respected artists in the city." Dan turned on her, his patience fraying to threads. "I told you to stay out of this," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. But it was too late. The diner erupted in a chorus of dissentum's gruff insistence, the young mother's quiet outrage, the cook's muttered curses from the kitchen. Dan's authority unraveled before his eyes, his fists clenching as he faced a room united against him. Marcus leaned forward, his voice cutting through the noise with a precision that silenced the murmurs. "It's interesting, isn't it?" he said, addressing Dan directly. "How quickly people see through a lie when they're not afraid to look." Dan's eyes snapped back to him, his anger a live wire sparking beneath his skin. "What's that supposed to mean?" he demanded, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. Marcus didn't flinch. "It means," he said, his words calm but piercing, that sometimes the harder you push a falsehood, the clearer it becomes to everyone watching. The diner fell silent again, the weight of his statement settling over the room like a storm cloud. Dan stood rigid, his face a twisted mask of frustration, embarrassment, and stubborn pride. He glanced around, meeting the hard stares of the patrons, their judgment a tangible force pressing against him. But Marcus wasn't finished. He picked up his pencil, his movements slow and deliberate, and began sketching on a fresh page. The soft scratch of graphite against paper filled the silence, a sound both soothing and defiant. Dan frowned, his confusion morphing into irritation. "What are you doing now?" he barked, his voice sharper than he intended. Marcus didn't look up. "What does it look like?" he replied, his tone serene, almost meditative. "I'm sketching." Dan's frustration flared, and he jabbed a finger at the pad. "That's enough." "He didn't say you could start drawing again." Marcus paused, the pencil hovering above the page, and met Dan's gaze with a faint, almost amused smile. "Didn't realize I needed your permission to practice my craft," he said, the words landing like a gentle slap. A ripple of laughter broke through the diner, soft but bold, the patrons feeding off Marcus's unshakable calm. Dan's face burned a deeper shade of red, his fists tightening until his knuckles popped. "You're trying to be a smartass," he growled, stepping closer, "but I'm not here for games. You're acting suspicious, and I've got every right to question you." Marcus set the pencil down, leaning back with a relaxed ease that belied the tension in the air. "Suspicious," he repeated, letting the word hang like a dare. "What's suspicious, officer? The fact that I'm sketching? Or the fact that I'm a black man in a diner?" The room seemed to hold its breath, Marcus's words slicing through Dan's bluster with a clarity that left no room for denial. Dan opened his mouth, but the response died in his throat, the weight of the accusation pinning him in place. "I didn't say that," he muttered at last, his voice small and unconvincing. Marcus's gaze didn't waver. "You didn't have to," he said, his tone steady but laced with a quiet power. "Your actions say it loud enough." Dan stood frozen, his chest heaving as the reality of his misstep crashed over him. The diner watched in silence, a collective witness to the unraveling of a man who'd wielded his power like a club, only to find it turned against him. Ellie wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes bright with a mix of fear and triumph. Tom shifted his weight, his arms still crossed, a silent sentinel of the community's resolve. The young mother hugged her child closer, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Marcus resumed sketching, the pencil moving with a grace that seemed to mock Dan's faltering authority. Each stroke was a testament to his resilience, a quiet rebellion against the assumptions that had tried to define him. Dan watched, his hands twitching at his sides, trapped between his pride and the undeniable truth. He'd lost control, not just of the room, but of the narrative he'd tried to force. The lesson hung heavy in the air. Justice wasn't a badge or a barked order. It was the courage to see people for who they were, not what they were assumed to be. And the consequences of abusing power, they were etched in Dan's flushed face, in the eyes of a diner that had chosen to stand, however quietly, against him. Marcus's calm resolve had shifted the balance, and the story, like his sketches, was his to shape. The air in the diner felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were inching closer with every breath Marcus took. He sat at his usual booth, sketchpad open in front of him, but the pencil in his hand had stilled. Around him, the patrons' regulars, who'd shared quiet mornings over coffee and eggshed, turned their attention his way. Their eyes weren't soft with curiosity anymore. They were sharp, piercing, drilling into him with a silent weight that drowned out the clatter of dishes and the hum of the overhead fans. Marcus felt it all here, judgment, their anticipation like a storm gathering strength, and yet he kept his composure, his broad shoulders steady under the strain. He leaned forward just enough to shift the air around him, his voice dropping low, a deliberate whisper that forced the entire room to lean in, straining to catch every word. "You know what's really suspicious, Officer Holloway?" he asked, his tone slow and thoughtful, like he was turning over a stone to see what lay beneath. The question hung there, heavy with intent, and Marcus let it linger, watching Dan Holloway's face tighten across the table. It's someone who uses their badge like a club, intimidating people for no reason at all. Someone who can't look in the mirror and admit they've crossed a line. Dan's jaw clenched hard, the muscles twitching under his skin as if he were biting back a snarl. For a split second, his hand twitched toward the table, and Marcus wondered if the officer might slam it down, might let the anger boiling inside him spill over into something reckless. But the room wasn't silent anymore. A low murmur rippled through the diner, growing louder with every heartbeat. Soft voices at first, then sharper, threaded with outrage and a quiet, unshakable solidarity. It wasn't just noise, it was a tide turning, and Dan felt it too. His eyes flickered, darting to the faces around him, and Marcus saw the crack in his armor, the way his certainty wavered under the weight of those watching. "That's enough," Dan snapped, his voice jagged with frustration, trembling at the edges like a wire stretched too thin. He wanted it to sound commanding, but it came out desperate. A man grasping at control that was slipping away. Marcus tilted his head, just a fraction, his dark eyes locking onto Dan's with a steadiness that felt like a challenge all on its own. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. "Then maybe it's time someone said it," he replied, his words landing like a hammer striking steel, ringing through the diner with a force that made Dan recoil. The officer's shoulders jerked back, his bravado peeling away like old paint, and Marcus could see the way the man's confidence crumbled under the calm, unrelenting pressure of his gaze. The murmurs swelled, a chorus of discontent rising from the booths and stools. Marcus picked up his pencil again, the soft scrape of graphite against paper cutting through the tension like a quiet act of defiance. He turned his focus back to his sketchpad, his long fingers moving with purpose. But the conversation wasn't over, not by a long shot. The balance had shifted, and Marcus knew it. He was in control now, steering the moment with a quiet strength that Dan hadn't anticipated. The officer stood there, rooted to the spot, his breath shallow, his authority slipping through his fingers like grains of sand, spilling onto the worn linoleum floor. A woman near the counter broke the uneasy quiet, her arms folded tight across her chest, her voice slicing through the growing hum like a blade. "Why don't you just leave the man alone?" she demanded, her tone sharp and unyielding, her graying hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun that matched the steel in her eyes. She'd been coming to this diner for years, knew Marcus's quiet presence as well as she knew the creak of the door. "He's not doing anything wrong." Her words sparked something, a flicker of agreement that spread fast. An elderly man by the window, his hands weathered from decades of work, nodded slowly, his voice gravelly but firm. "Yeah, we've been here forever, and Marcus, always respectful. You're the one stirring up trouble, Holloway." Dan's eyes darted around the room, wild and unsteady, his face a storm of anger and something else, unease, maybe even fear. His uniform, once a symbol of unquestioned power, felt flimsy now, like a costume that didn't fit quite right. The collective disapproval pressed down on him, heavy and unyielding, a house of cards trembling in the wind. But Marcus wasn't done. With a slow, deliberate motion, he tore a page from his sketchpad, the sound sharp and commanding, pulling every eye in the room. He set it on the table, letting it sit there like an offering or a challenge. Then he stood, his tall frame unfolding from the booth, towering over the space with a presence that was calm but impossible to ignore. His movements were measured, controlled, every step radiating a quiet power that made the air feel charged. "Officer Holloway," Marcus said, his voice steady and resonant, cutting through the din like a bell tolling. "If you're so sure I'm a threat, why don't you arrest me, right here, right now, in front of all these people? Let's see how that plays out for you." The words were bold, a gauntlet thrown down, and the diner fell silent, every breath held, every eye locked on Dan. The officer's face flushed crimson, his frustration bubbling up like steam, but his hands stayed at his sides, trembling with the effort of holding himself together. "You think you're clever," he sneered, but his voice quivered, betraying the bravado he was clinging to. "You think you can turn these people against me?" Marcus took a step closer, his gaze unflinching, his voice low and even. "I don't need to turn anyone against you, officer. You're managing that just fine on your own." The words hit Dan like a physical blow, and he flinched, his shoulders hunching as the weight of the crowd's judgment bore down harder. Their eyes, dozens of them, were a mirror, reflecting back the arrogance, the pettiness, the misuse of power he'd wielded so carelessly. Then Marcus did something unexpected. He slid the torn sketch across the table toward Dan, the paper whispering against the wood. "Here," he said simply, his tone neutral, but laced with something deeper, something that demanded attention. Dan hesitated, his brow furrowing as he reached for the page. His fingers brushed the edge, then closed around it, lifting it with a reluctance that betrayed his unease. It was a drawing of the diner, but not just any sketch. This one was alive, the lines sharp and vivid, the details so precise they seemed to pulse with energy. At the center wasn't the room itself, but a figure, Officer Holloway, standing tall and imposing, hand on his hip, looming over an artist seated at a booth. The expression on the figure's face was unmistakable, arrogance etched into every stroke, distrust narrowing the eyes, misplaced authority hardening the jaw. It was Dan, captured in ink, a portrait of the moment they were all living, and the room seemed to hold its breath as he stared at it. For the first time, Dan looked lost, his bravado fracturing under the weight of Marcus's artistry. The sketch wasn't just a drawing, it was a reckoning, a truth laid bare for everyone to see. "You're good at making judgments," Marcus said softly, his voice breaking the silence like a stone dropping into still water. "So tell me, officer, what does this look like to you?" Dan didn't answer. His hand shook as he set the paper down, the edges crinkling under his grip. The patrons leaned in, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the sketch that had struck such a nerve. Marcus sat back down, picking up his pencil as if nothing had happened, his movement smooth and unhurried. "Take your time," he said, his tone calm but pointed, a quiet edge beneath it. "I've got all day." The room buzzed with whispers, a hive of commentary swirling around them. Dan's face was a battlefield, anger warring with shame, confusion tangling with the stubborn pride that had carried him this far. He gripped the sketch tighter, his knuckles whitening as if he could crush the truth it held. But the patrons watched, their eyes keen and expectant, waiting for his next move. Marcus kept sketching, the soft scratch of his pencil a steady rhythm against the chaos, a reminder of his unshakable focus. He didn't need to say more, the situation spoke for itself, a lesson in justice unfolding in real time. "Nice drawing," Dan muttered at last, his voice low and bitter, dripping with resentment. "Too bad it doesn't mean anything." Marcus paused, his pencil hovering mid-stroke, then looked up, his expression one of mild curiosity, like he was studying a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. "Doesn't mean anything?" he echoed, his voice rising just enough to carry across the diner, inviting everyone into the moment. "Funny. I thought art was supposed to hold a mirror up to the truth." Dan's jaw tightened again, his grip on the sketch loosening as the weight of those words sank in. The drawing so raw, so exact, it pierced something in him, and the patrons saw it too. They weren't just onlookers anymore, they were part of this, drawn into Marcus's world by the power of his pencil. A teenager sitting with his parents near the counter piped up, his voice clear and bold, cutting through the tension. "That sketch looks exactly like what's happening right now. Even the way you're standing, it's kind of freaky how spot on it is." Dan shot the boy a glare, but the kid didn't back down. Instead, he glanced at Marcus, his eyes bright with admiration. "You're really talented, man." Marcus gave a small nod, a flicker of gratitude crossing his face, but his focus stayed on Dan. "Art doesn't lie, officer," he said, his tone steady and unyielding, a quiet force that filled the room. "It's just a mirror. If you don't like what you see, maybe the problem isn't the art." The air shifted again, the power tipping further toward Marcus as the murmurs grew louder, a rising tide of voices questioning Dan's every move. "You've made your point," Dan snapped, his voice strained, cracking under the pressure. "Maybe you think you're clever, but I've got nothing to apologize for. I'm doing my job." "Your job," Marcus repeated, raising an eyebrow, his hands folding on the table as he set his pencil down with deliberate care. "Tell me, officer, how exactly does harassing an innocent man in a diner fit into that? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you walked in here hunting for trouble, and when you didn't find any, you decided to make some. Why is that? Is it the sketchpad that bothers you?" Or is it me because I don't look like I fit your idea of who belongs here? The question hung there, raw and unfiltered, and Dan bristled, his chest puffing out instinctively. But the crowd's gaze held him fast. They weren't just watching now, they were waiting, demanding an answer. The woman near the front spoke again, her arms still crossed, her voice steady and accusing. "We've all seen what's going on here. You don't need to explain it, Marcush does." She jabbed a finger toward Dan, her eyes narrowing with a mix of frustration and resolve. Dan's face flushed deeper, his eyes bouncing between Marcus and the woman, then sweeping the room as the judgment closed in around him. For the first time, he seemed to feel the shift, the way control had slipped from his grasp and settled firmly in Marcus's hands. Marcus leaned forward just a touch, his voice dropping low but firm, carrying the weight of the moment. "So, officer, what's it going to be? Are you going to keep digging this hole deeper? Or are you going to face what's staring you in the face?" The diner held its breath, the tension thick enough to choke on, as Dan stood there, a man unraveling under the scrutiny of a room full of witnesses and a single sketch that had turned his world upside down. Marcus didn't move, didn't push, just waited, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Dan's unraveling. The lesson was clear. Power misused would always meet its match, and justice, quiet as it might be, had a way of cutting through the noise. The air in the diner hung heavy, thick with a tension that seemed to cling to every surface chip from mica tables, cracked vinyl seats, even the faded checkered curtains swaying faintly by the window. Dan stood frozen, his lips parted as if words were clawing their way up his throat, only to falter and die before they could escape. His chest heaved with short, jagged breaths, each one betraying the storm brewing inside him. He was a man at a crossroads, teetering on the edge of something he couldn't quite name, and every soul in that cramped little room could feel it. The silence stretched on, taut and expectant, like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. All eyes were on him, watchful, unyielding, stripping away the armor he'd worn so confidently just moments before. Marcus sat across the table, his posture relaxed, arms folded casually over his chest. He didn't need to say another word. The truth was already doing the heavy lifting. His dark eyes, steady and piercing, held a quiet power that seemed to fill the space between them. He wasn't pushing, wasn't prodding, just waiting, letting the weight of the moment settle squarely on Dan's shoulders. The crowd around them, a mix of diner regulars and curious onlookers, held their breath in unison, a collective pause that pulsed with anticipation. Forks hovered over half-eaten plates of greasy fries and runny eggs. Coffee cups lingered midair, forgotten. They weren't just spectators, were witnesses, their presence amplifying the unraveling scene. Dan's face flushed a deep, angry red, the color creeping up his neck like a wildfire spreading through dry grass. His hands trembled faintly, clutching a sketch pad he'd snatched earlier in a fit of misplaced authority. That single sheet of paper, adorned with a drawing so raw and honest it seemed to breathe, felt like a lead weight in his grip, far heavier than any incident report he'd ever filed. The image stared back at him, a stark, unflinching portrait of himself, not as the officer he imagined himself to be, but as the man he'd revealed in this moment. His uniform, once a shield of certainty, now felt like a costume slipping off his frame. He stood there, exposed, the ground beneath him crumbling with every passing second. The patrons weren't just siding with Marcus, they were a living jury, their gazes cutting through the flimsy excuses Dan had tried to drape over his actions. He'd walked into this diner, chest puffed with the arrogance of his badge, zeroing in on Marcus the moment he'd crossed the threshold. Why? Because of a sketch pad, a pencil, or something deeper, something uglier? The question hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. Dan's breath quickened, his mind racing to find footing in the quicksand of his own making. He could feel the eyes boring into him, elderly folks by the window sipping lukewarm coffee, a teenage boy perched on a stool by the counter, a middle-aged woman wiping her hands on a napkin near the register. They'd seen it all unfold, and their silence was louder than any accusation. Finally, the dam broke. "Look," Dan said, his voice cracking like thin ice underfoot. "Maybe I was a little overzealous. I was just doing my job." The words sounded hollow even to his own ears, a weak attempt to claw back some semblance of control. The bravado he'd swaggered in with had evaporated, leaving behind a man grasping at straws. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression unshaken. "Your job," he repeated, his voice soft but laced with a quiet force that made Dan flinch. "What exactly does your job require you to do, officer?" "Intimidate innocent people. Judge them by the way they look." Each word landed like a stone, deliberate and precise, sinking into the cracks of Dan's defenses. The officer's eyes darted to the sketch still clutched in his hand, but he couldn't meet Marcus's gaze. Instead, he muttered under his breath, "I'm not racist, all right. That's not what this is about." Marcus leaned back, his calm unshaken, his tone thoughtful yet razor-sharp. "Not racist," he mused, letting the words linger in the air like smoke. "And yet, here we are." The room stirred, a low murmur rippling through the crowd. The woman by the counter, her apron stained with coffee and ketchup from a long shift, stepped forward, her voice cutting through the haze. "If you're not racist, officer, then why'd you pick him out? He wasn't bothering a soul. He's in here all the time, sketching away, same as always. But the second you walked in, you locked onto him like he'd robbed the place." Her words were firm, her hands planted on her hips, her tired eyes blazing with a righteousness born of too many hard days. Dan's lips pressed into a tight, thin line, his jaw clenching as he struggled to muster a response. Before he could, the teenage boy at the counter piped up, his voice shaky but bold, fueled by the growing tide of support around him. "Yeah, you even said he looked suspicious." "Suspicious how? 'Cause he's drawing? Or 'cause he's black?" The kid's hands fidgeted with the straw in his soda, but his stare was unwavering, his youthful defiance cutting deeper than he knew. Dan's shoulders slumped, the weight of their words pressing down like a physical force. He was cornered, trapped in a cage of his own construction, and he knew it. But instead of yielding, he doubled down, his voice rising in a desperate bid to reclaim control. "Look, I have a responsibility to keep this neighborhood safe," he snapped, his fists balling at his sides. "I can't just ignore someone who might be a threat." Marcus's gaze didn't waver. "A threat," he said, his voice still calm but edged with steel. He gestured to the sketch pad on the table, its pages fluttering slightly in the draft from the open window. "What about me says threat to you, officer? The pencil, the paper, or is it something else entirely?" The question hung there, sharp and unanswerable, slicing through the last threads of Dan's justification. The crowd watched, their collective judgment a tangible thing, filling the room like a rising tide. An elderly man by the window, his gnarled hands wrapped around a chipped mug, leaned forward in his seat. His voice was steady, weathered by years, but carried a quiet disappointment that hit harder than anger. "You know the answer to that, son," he said, his eyes locking onto Dan's. "And so does everyone else in this room." The words weren't loud, but they landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the diner's worn walls. Dan's composure fractured further, the flimsy facade he'd built crumbling into dust. His fists clenched tighter, knuckles whitening, the tension coiling in his body like a spring ready to snap. Sweat beaded on his forehead, glistening under the diner's flickering fluorescent lights. Marcus, ever the picture of calm, leaned forward just slightly, his voice softening but carrying the weight of everything that had unfolded. "The thing about authority, Officer Holloway," he said, "is that it comes with responsibility. Responsibility to act with integrity, to treat people with respect, to admit when you're wrong." The words cut through Dan like a blade, slicing past his pride and exposing the raw, quivering truth beneath. Dan's face twitched, his eyes darting around the room, taking in the faces staring back at him. They weren't just watching, they were waiting, holding their breath for him to confront the reality he'd tried so hard to deny. He was teetering on a precipice, caught between the man he thought he was and the man he'd shown himself to be. His shoulders sagged, the sketch still gripped tightly in his hand. That drawing, its bold lines and unflinching detail, seemed to mock him, a mirror he couldn't escape. He stared at it, unable to hold its gaze for long, yet unable to let it go, as if the paper itself were anchoring him to this moment of reckoning. The silence pressed in, heavy and unrelenting. No one spoke, but the weight of their scrutiny was suffocating. Marcus broke it at last, his voice quieter now but no less resolute. You don't have to dig yourself deeper, officer. You can stop right here. It's not too late. Dan's head snapped up, a flicker of pride flaring in his chest. Stop what? I didn't. He caught himself mid-sentence, the defensive words faltering as they left his lips. He glanced around again, at the faces of the patrons who'd witnessed every misstep, every excuse. The badge he'd always leaned on felt distant now, a flimsy shield against the truth staring him down. Marcus leaned forward, his tone measured but deliberate. We all make mistakes, Dan. The difference between a good man and a bully is what you do after you realize you're wrong. The word bully hit Dan like a punch, though there was no malice in Marcus's voice, just a calm clarity that made it sting all the more. Dan's eyes dropped back to the sketch, a storm of emotions swirling in his chest, shame, anger, and something softer, something that might have been the first stirrings of reflection. The teenage boy spoke up again, his voice cutting through the tension. It's okay to admit you messed up, he said, his tone earnest, almost gentle. Everybody messes up. It's how you fix it that matters. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that seemed to settle over Dan like a blanket. For a moment, the officer's grip on the sketch tightened, the paper crumpling under his fingers. His jaw clenched, stubbornness warring with surrender in his expression. Then, slowly, his shoulders slumped further, and his face softened at just a fraction, but enough to hint at a shift. He set the sketch on the table, smoothing its creased edges with a trembling hand. All right, he said at last, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier bluster. Maybe I came on too strong. Maybe I jumped to conclusions I shouldn't have. The admission hung in the air, fragile but real. The crowd didn't burst into applause or rush to forgive him, but their collective gaze softened slightly, the pressure easing like a storm cloud beginning to dissipate. It wasn't absolution not yet, but it was a step, a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. That's a start, he said, his voice steady. But words aren't enough. Actions matter more. Dan's jaw tightened again, though this time it wasn't diffy in seat, was the look of a man wrestling with the weight of his own flaws. He gave a stiff nod, his throat too tight to risk another word. Marcus picked up his pencil, returning to his sketch pad as if the confrontation had never happened. The soft scratch of lead on paper filled the space, a quiet rhythm that seemed to anchor the room. But the tension lingered, the crowd still watching, not quite ready to release Dan from their silent judgment. The elderly man by the window spoke again, his voice calm but firm. You've got a lot to think about, son, and a lot to make right. Don't waste this moment. His words were a gentle command, laced with the wisdom of someone who'd seen too many chances slip away. Dan didn't reply. He nodded once more, a jerky motion, then turned toward the door. The bell above it jingled as he pushed it open, a sharp, cheerful sound that felt out of place in the heavy air. He paused on the threshold, his silhouette framed against the bright sunlight outside. Without turning back, he muttered, "Have a good day," before stepping out and letting the door swing shut behind him. The sound echoed faintly, a final note in the storm that had just passed. Inside, the diner slowly stirred back to life. Conversations resumed in low murmurs. Forks clinked against plates, and the hum of normalcy crept back in. Marcus remained seated, his pencil gliding over the page with fluid, practiced strokes. He was sketching again, his focus unshaken. But there was a quiet strength in his posture, a subtle triumph that radiated outward. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but today, he'd won something, and everyone in the room felt it. Outside, the sun blazed down on the cracked pavement, the world spinning on as if nothing had changed. But inside those weathered walls, the atmosphere had shifted. Marcus's pencil moved with purpose, each line a testament to the moment he'd just claimed. He wasn't drawing for himself anymore, he was preserving this, etching it into something that would outlast the diner's peeling paint and sagging booths. The teenage boy approached his table, hands shoved deep into his pockets, his sneakers scuffing the linoleum floor. "That was amazing," he said, his voice tinged with awe. "The way you stayed calm, even when he was so wrong. How'd you do that?" Marcus looked up, offering a faint, knowing smile. "Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is stay quiet," he said simply. "People show you who they are if you let them." The trick is knowing when to speak and when to listen. The boy nodded, his eyes bright with admiration. Do you think he'll change? He asked, glancing toward the door where Dan had disappeared. Marcus's pencil paused, his gaze drifting somewhere distant. Maybe, he said after a moment, his voice thoughtful, but that's up to him. Justice isn't just about calling out what's wrong, it's about what comes after. And so are the consequences of power. If he learns that, he might surprise us. If he doesn't, he trailed off, letting the unspoken hang in the air, heavy with possibility. The boy lingered, absorbing the words, then shuffled back to his stool. Marcus returned to his sketching, the diner settling around him like a world recalibrating itself. Outside, Dan's footsteps faded into the hum of the day, but the lesson lingered sharp, undeniable, and etched into every corner of that small, unassuming space. Power could build or destroy, and justice wasn't just a verdict, it was a choice. One Dan would have to live with long after the bell stopped ringing. In the stillness of the diner, the boy stood there, his young face etched with a mixture of uncertainty and reluctant acceptance. Marcus had just spoken words that hung in the air like a lingering echo, words that carried the weight of truth, whether the boy liked it or not. Maybe it's up to him, Marcus had said, his voice steady but not unkind. But he's got no excuse now. He's seen it plain as day. The boy's head bobbed in a slow, deliberate nod, as if he were tucking the lesson deep into the folds of his mind, a seed of wisdom he might one day unravel when the time was right. His lips parted briefly, a quiet thanks slipping out soft. Almost swallowed by the hum of the room bore, he shuffled back to his table. His sneakers scuffed against the worn linoleum floor, and his shoulders slumped slightly, not in defeat, but in the heavy realization that some truths couldn't be unseen. Nearby, the waitress had been watching the exchange from the edge of the counter, her fingers nervously twisting the corner of her apron. She'd hovered there for minutes, her hazel eyes darting between Marcus and the boy, as if waiting for the courage to step into the moment. Finally, she did. With a tentative grace, she approached Marcus's table, her hands trembling just enough to make the coffee cup rattle faintly against its saucer. As she set it down before him, the steam curled upward, carrying the rich, bitter scent of fresh brew into the air. "This one's on the house," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, laced with a shy admiration that made her cheeks flush. She offered a small smile, one that flickered like a candle flame caught in a draft. Marcus looked up from his sketchbook, his dark eyes meeting hers with a warmth that softened the hard lines of his face. "You don't have to do that," he said gently, his tone carrying a trace of surprise, as if kindness from strangers was a gift he'd long stopped expecting. But she shook her head, her ponytail swaying with the motion, resolute despite her nerves. "After what you just did, it's the least I can do," she replied, her words gaining strength as she spoke. "People like Yoayu don't just sit there and let things happen. You make us believe there's still hope out there." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, a quiet reverence shining through, before she stepped back, retreating to the safety of her counter. Marcus watched her go, then let a small, genuine smile tug at the corners of his mouth. He lifted the cup in a silent toast to her, to the moment before bringing it to his lips. The coffee was hot, grounding, a simple comfort amid the storm of thoughts swirling in his head. As the diner's familiar buzz returned, forks clinking against plates, low murmurs weaving through the air, patrons seemed to shift in their seats, their minds turning inward. Conversations blossomed in hushed tones, threading through topics that rarely surfaced in the everyday chatter of this small-town haunt. They spoke of fairness, of justice, of the insidious ways prejudice could slip into the cracks of ordinary life unnoticed, like a slow leak poisoning the well. The incident with Officer Dan Holloway had ignited something, a spark of awareness, a ripple of unease that pushed them to face truths they'd rather leave buried. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was there, simmering beneath the surface, a collective awakening that felt fragile yet undeniable. Outside, the air was crisp, tinged with the faint metallic scent of an impending spring rain. Dan Holloway sat alone in his patrol car, the leather seat creaking under his weight as he hunched over the steering wheel. In his hands, he clutched a crumpled sketch, Marcus's work, a mirror held up to his soul. His thick fingers trembled as he smoothed out the paper, the creases resisting his efforts. as if they, too, were stubborn witnesses to his shame. The drawing stared back at him, its lines stark and unflinching, capturing not just his face, but the man he'd become, a man he barely recognized anymore. His jaw tightened, muscles flexing beneath the stubble, and his chest heaved with a slow, ragged breath. For the first time in years, he felt small, insignificant because of the crowd that had watched him falter, nor even because of Marcus's quiet strength, but because of the weight of his own choices pressing down on him. He leaned back, the headrest cool against his neck, and let his eyes drift to the world beyond the windshield. The diner glowed softly against the gray sky, its windows casting golden rectangles onto the pavement. Everything seemed sharper now, more vivid colors of the fading neon sign, the glint of wet asphalt, the distant hum of life moving on without him. It was as if a veil had lifted, and he was seeing it all for the first time, unfiltered and raw. Could he change? Did he even want to? The questions gnawed at him, relentless, but he had no answer. Suddenly, the faint stirring of something new, something alive, taking root in the barren soil of his conscience. He folded the sketch carefully, tucking it into his pocket, a silent promise to himself that he wasn't sure he could keep. Back inside, Marcus sat at his table, his pencil moving steadily across the page. The lines he drew weren't just shapes, they were fragments of the moment, snapshots of emotion and truth woven into every stroke. He didn't need to glance up to feel the change in the room. It was subtle, a quiet solidarity that pulsed through the air like a shared heartbeat. The old man at the counter, his gnarled hands wrapped around a mug, stared into his coffee as if searching for answers in its depths. The young couple in the corner booth whispered to each other, their heads bent close, their words laced with a newfound urgency. Even the waitress, wiping down the counter with slow, deliberate swipes, seemed to carry herself differently, straighter, prouder, as if she'd been part of something bigger than herself. Marcus knew this was just one moment, one small victory in a battle that stretched far beyond the diner's walls. The road to justice was long, paved with setbacks and sacrifices, and he'd walked it long enough to understand its toll. But as he finished the final line of his drawing, a depiction of the diner's patrons, united in their quiet strength, allowed himself a fleeting moment of satisfaction. It wasn't pride, not exactly, but a deep, steady resolve. The fight wasn't over, and the shadows of power misused still loomed. Eden Holloway was proof of that. A man who'd wielded authority like a weapon until it turned against him. Yet today, justice had inched forward, a tentative step toward something better. And sometimes, Marcus thought as he set his pencil down, the soft clink of it against the table echoing in his ears, that was enough to keep going.